The seeds of the Badab War were sown before the first shots were fired in the closing centuries of the 41st millennium. What would eventually engulf multiple Space Marine chapters and Imperial forces in a bitter civil war began with the ambitions of one man, Lufgt Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws. Huron's rise to power came in the year 715 of the 41st millennium after the death of his predecessor during the suppression of the Lycanthos Drift Uprising. Even in his early years as chapter master, Huron displayed exceptional tactical acumen and leadership qualities that earned him respect throughout the Maelstrom Zone. Standing at an imposing height with a stern, weathered face bearing numerous battle scars, Huron cut an impressive figure. His penetrating gaze could make even veteran Astartes uncomfortable, and his commanding presence filled any chamber he entered. The Astral Claws under Huron's leadership quickly gained a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He reorganized the chapter's command structure, personally selecting officers based on merit rather than tradition, and implemented new combat doctrines that emphasized rapid deployment and overwhelming force. These reforms transformed the Astral Claws from a relatively unremarkable chapter into one of the most effective fighting forces in the sector. The Maelstrom Zone itself represented one of the Imperium's most troubled regions. Bordering the massive warp storm known as the Maelstrom, the area had long been a haven for pirates, renegades, and xenos raiders who would emerge from the storm's protective veil to prey upon Imperial shipping and colonies. The swirling purple-black mass of the Maelstrom dominated the region's void, visible from planetary surfaces as a baleful light that never set, a constant reminder of the thin barrier between civilization and chaos. Strategically, the Maelstrom Zone served as a critical buffer protecting the heavily populated Segmentum Solar and the vital shipping lanes of the Segmentum Ultima. The loss of this buffer would potentially expose dozens of sectors to raiders emerging from the warp storm. This strategic importance was not matched by adequate Imperial resources, however. The Administratum, in its Byzantine wisdom, had designated the Astral Claws as the primary defenders of this troubled region without providing the necessary support structure. By the year 796 of the 41st millennium, Huron had begun referring to himself as the Lord of the Maelstrom, a title that raised eyebrows among Imperial authorities, but was initially dismissed as mere warrior bravado. His chapter's fortress monastery on Badab Primaris had been expanded into a formidable bastion, its dark adamantium towers and massive gun emplacements visible from orbit. The planet itself, rich in mineral resources and home to numerous manufacturing facilities, became increasingly central to Huron's growing power base. The Badab sector's economic importance cannot be overstated in understanding the conflict that would follow. The sector contained numerous resource-rich worlds whose industrial output was vital to Imperial operations throughout the surrounding regions. Forge worlds, mining colonies, and manufacturing hubs dotted the sector, their orbital docks constantly busy with freighters and supply ships. The Administratum demanded substantial tithes from these worlds, drawing away resources that Huron increasingly felt should be dedicated to the defense of the Maelstrom Zone. The first open disagreement between Huron and Imperial authorities came in 901, when he refused to submit the Badab sector's Geneseed tithe to the Adeptus Mechanicus. His justification, that his chapter needed to maintain its fighting strength to defend the Imperium, seemed reasonable on the surface. The Astral Claws had indeed suffered losses in recent campaigns against Eldar corsairs emerging from the Maelstrom. However, this refusal represented a significant breach of protocol. The Geneseed tithe was not merely administrative bureaucracy, but a sacred duty and a practical necessity for monitoring the genetic purity of the Adeptus Astartes. Administratum officials responded by demanding increased material tithes from the Badab sector to compensate for the perceived defiance. This punitive measure only exacerbated tensions. Huron, now effectively controlling the sector's governance through a network of compliant planetary governors and administrators, began redirecting these resources to strengthen his military position rather than submitting them to Terra. The Administratum's response was predictably bureaucratic and slow. Multiple delegations were sent to Badab Primaris over the following years, each returning with promises from Huron that were never fulfilled. Meanwhile, the Astral Claws chapter strength mysteriously grew beyond the 1,000-warrior limit prescribed by the Codex Astartes. Reports from traders and Imperial officials visiting Badab noted unusual numbers of Astartes present at the fortress monastery and patrolling the sector. By 903, Huron had formalized his control over the region by establishing the Maelstrom Warders, a coalition of Space Marine chapters tasked with defending the Maelstrom Zone. On paper, this arrangement seemed perfectly legitimate. The Lamenters and Mantis Warriors chapters, both with honorable histories of service to the Imperium, agreed to join this coalition. The Executioners, a fierce chapter known for its headhunting traditions and brutal combat doctrines, completed the alliance. The formation ceremony on Badab Primaris was conducted with all the pomp and ceremony befitting such an occasion. Chapter masters and honor guards from all 4 chapters stood in the great obsidian hall of the Astral Claws Fortress Monastery, their different heraldries creating a striking tableau against the dark stone. Huron, resplendent in artificer armor of burnished gold and deep sea green, presented each chapter master with an ornate power weapon as a symbol of their new brotherhood. The weapons, masterworks crafted by the finest artificers of Badab, featured hilts worked with precious metals and power fields of unusual potency. What made the Maelstrom Warders' arrangement particularly troubling to distant Imperial authorities was that it established Huron as the supreme commander of all 4 chapters when operating in the Maelstrom Zone. While such coalitions were not unprecedented in Imperial history, they typically operated under the authority of the High Lords of Terra, or at least with their explicit blessing. Huron had secured no such authorization, instead presenting the alliance as a practical necessity that required no external approval. The Warders' Pact effectively placed a significant military force, potentially 4,000 Astartes along with their warships, support personnel, and equipment, under Huron's direct command. The Astral Claws fleet had also been substantially expanded, with several vessels of unknown origin joining their armada. These ships, their hulls repainted in Astral Claws colors, but bearing signs of previous service elsewhere, raised questions that Huron deflected with vague explanations about reclaimed assets and gifts from grateful sector governors. Throughout this period, Huron's physical appearance began to change subtly. Always an imposing figure, he now seemed to radiate an almost palpable aura of authority. His speeches to his chapter became increasingly focused on the Imperium's failings and the necessity of self-reliance. He spoke of a new compact between the Astartes and humanity, one that would restore the Space Marines to their rightful place as humanity's rulers rather than its servants. The economic factors fueling the growing conflict became increasingly apparent as the decade progressed. The Badab sector's industrial output was being systematically diverted to strengthen the Maelstrom Warders. New defense platforms appeared in orbit around key worlds. Planetary defense forces received better equipment and training from Astartes instructors. Forge facilities on Badab Primaris and other worlds worked at full capacity, producing weapons, armor, and vehicles. All of this military buildup required resources that should have been tithed to the wider Imperium. The Administratum estimated that the Badab sector's tithe compliance had fallen to less than 20% of mandated levels. Cargo ships that should have carried manufactured goods, raw materials, and conscripts to other Imperial worlds were instead being used to fortify the Maelstrom Zone. Huron justified these actions through a series of astute political maneuvers. He provided extensive documentation of Maelstrom-based threats to Imperial shipping and colonies. His reports detailed dozens of raids by Chaos warbands, Orc freebooters, and Eldar corsairs, all supposedly emanating from the Warp Storm. While many of these threats were real, later analysis by inquisitorial authorities would suggest that Huron significantly exaggerated their scope and frequency. The Carthene sector lords, whose territories bordered the Maelstrom Zone, initially supported Huron's position. They had benefited from the increased security provided by the Maelstrom Warders, seeing a marked decrease in raider activity along their trade routes. Their endorsement lent credibility to Huron's claims and temporarily shielded him from more direct Imperial scrutiny. By 906, Huron had begun to refer to himself as the Tyrant of Badab, a title he claimed reflected the ancient Terran meaning of a strong ruler rather than a despot. His chapter serfs and the population of Badab Primaris used the title with reverence, and even some of his Astartes had adopted it in formal communications. The tyrant's personal guard, drawn from the elite veterans of the Astral Claws First Company, wore distinctive red gauntlets symbolizing both their elite status and, some whispered, the blood they had shed in their master's name. The transformation of Lufgt Huron from a loyal servant of the Imperium to the self-styled Tyrant of Badab was not sudden but gradual. Each step away from Imperial authority was justified by necessity, each expansion of power rationalized as being for the greater good. Those within his growing sphere of influence saw a visionary leader taking necessary action to protect Imperial citizens when distant Terra would not. Those observing from outside increasingly saw a renegade warlord building his own empire. The Maelstrom warders operated with growing autonomy, responding to threats without waiting for authorization from sector authorities. Their campaigns became more aggressive, striking at suspected raider bases within the fringes of the Maelstrom itself. These operations were largely successful, but they also expanded Huron's sphere of influence beyond the borders established by Imperial cartographers. By the year 907 of the 41st millennium, the situation had reached a critical point. The Administratum, tired of delays and excuses, dispatched a substantial fleet of tithe ships to Badab, escorted by vessels from the Imperial Navy. Their mission was to collect the overdue tithes by force if necessary. This fleet, approaching the Badab sector with the full authority of Terra behind it, would force Huron to make a fateful choice: submit to Imperial authority or openly defy it. The first overt act of defiance from Lufgt Huron came in 908, when he formally rejected the Administratum's demands for increased tithes from the Badab sector. In a carefully worded astropathic transmission to Terra, Huron cited ongoing security concerns and the Emperor's higher purpose of safeguarding human lives as justification for redirecting resources to the Maelstrom Zone's defenses. This message, while couched in respectful language, represented a calculated escalation of the brewing conflict. Huron's withholding of gene-seed tithes to the Adeptus Mechanicus began as early as 901, but became systematic by 904. The Magos Biologists dispatched 3 separate delegations to Badab Primaris during this period, each returning with different excuses from the Astral Claws apothecaries. Initially, Huron claimed combat losses had depleted their reserves. Later, he cited contamination concerns from exposure to unknown xenos bioforms within the Maelstrom. By the third delegation, the Astral Claws simply refused the Mechanicus representatives access to their apothecarian, claiming security protocols prevented outsider examination of their sacred gene-seed vaults. The Magos Biologists, deeply troubled by these developments, filed formal complaints with both the Adeptus Terra and the High Lords. Their records indicated the Astral Claws should have accumulated substantial gene-seed reserves despite their claimed combat losses. More concerning, genetic samples obtained surreptitiously from wounded Astral Claws suggested subtle but detectable deviations from their established genetic baseline. Behind the walls of their fortress monastery on Badab Primaris, the Astral Claws were undergoing a transformation that violated one of the Codex Astartes' most fundamental tenets. Surveillance reports from Imperial agents and testimonies from merchant captains visiting Badab suggested the chapter's strength had grown well beyond the prescribed 1,000 battle brothers. By the year 910 of the 41st millennium, conservative estimates placed their numbers at nearly 1,500 Astartes, with some reports suggesting even higher figures. This expansion was achieved through accelerated recruitment and implantation protocols that sacrificed caution for speed. Huron had ordered his apothecaries to reduce the standard testing period for neophytes and implemented a streamlined implantation schedule that increased the risk of rejection but produced combat-ready Astartes more quickly. The casualties from this process were hidden from Imperial observers, with failed aspirants either quietly disposed of or, according to some darker rumors, used as servitor material within the fortress monastery. To disguise this expansion, Huron created a paper legion, the Tiger Claws, ostensibly a separate chapter operating under Astral Claws guidance. This fiction allowed him to explain away the presence of Adeptus Astartes when questioned by Imperial authorities. The Tiger Claws supposedly suffered from gene seed degradation and were working closely with the Astral Claws while seeking remediation. In reality, these were simply Astral Claws wearing slightly modified insignia when operating in circumstances where they might encounter Imperial scrutiny. The deception extended to the chapter's fleet assets as well. Vessels officially decommissioned in Administratum records continued to operate under new designations. The battle barge Emperor's Judgment, reportedly lost to warp turbulence in 906, was sighted multiple times in subsequent years, bearing the name Punisher, its hull repainted but its distinctive silhouette unchanged. The most alarming development came in the year 911, with what later became known as the Carthan Incident. A flotilla of Administratum tithe ships, escorted by the Imperial Navy frigate Righteous Fury, approached the mining world of Carthan in the Badab sector to collect its overdue mineral tithes. They were intercepted by the Astral Claws strike cruiser Fire of Heaven, which demanded they withdraw from the system. When Captain Lysander of the Righteous Fury insisted on completing his assigned mission, citing direct orders from the Adeptus Terra, the Fire of Heaven opened fire without further warning. The Imperial frigate was crippled in a precise volley that disabled its engines and weapons while leaving life support intact, a calculated display of superior firepower rather than an attempt at destruction. The tithe ships were boarded by Astral Claws boarding parties who removed their navigators and astropaths before allowing the vessels to retreat from the system. The Carthan Incident marked the first direct military action against Imperial authorities. Huron carefully managed the political fallout, dispatching formal apologies to Battle Fleet Scaris and the Administratum, claiming the Fire of Heaven's captain had exceeded his authority and would be disciplined. He even offered compensation for damages to the Imperial vessels. This measured response, combined with the fact that no Imperial lives had been lost, prevented an immediate military retaliation. Behind the scenes, however, the captain of the Fire of Heaven received no punishment. Instead, he was promoted to command the Astral Claws flagship, the battle barge Acrusia. The message to Huron's officers was clear: defiance of Imperial authority would be rewarded, not punished, so long as it was executed with precision and restraint. The Carthan Incident triggered a more thorough investigation by the Adeptus Terra. Inquisitor Legate Frayne of the Ordo Hereticus was dispatched to assess the situation in the Badab sector. His attempts to reach Badab Primaris were repeatedly delayed by navigational hazards and scheduling conflicts. When he finally arrived in, he was received with elaborate ceremony, but effectively prevented from conducting any meaningful investigation. His escort of Astral Claws, honor guards, ensured he spoke only with pre-selected individuals and visited only carefully prepared locations. Frayne's report to the Inquisition noted the unusual level of control exerted by the Astral Claws over civilian governance in the sector. Planetary governors deferred to chapter representatives on matters ranging from resource allocation to law enforcement. The Adeptus Arbite's presence in the sector had been gradually reduced, with many precincts standing empty or repurposed for Astral Claws use. Most concerning, the flow of information to and from the sector was tightly controlled, with astropathic communications subjected to what Huron termed security screening before transmission. Huron's political maneuvering extended beyond his own sector. He cultivated relationships with neighboring sector governors, particularly those who benefited from the increased security provided by the Maelstrom warders. Trade agreements favorable to these sectors were arranged, creating a network of political allies who would speak in Huron's defense when questions were raised in the halls of power on Terra. The manipulation of fellow Astartes chapters within the Maelstrom Zone represented Huron's most significant political achievement. The Lamenters, a chapter with a troubled history and a desperate need for allies, were particularly susceptible to his influence. Huron provided them with resources, intelligence, and support that had been denied them elsewhere in the Imperium due to their connection to the cursed 21st founding. In return, the Lamenters became his most loyal supporters within the Maelstrom Warders. The Mantis Warriors, a chapter with a proud heritage but limited resources, were drawn into Huron's orbit through a combination of respect for his tactical acumen and the practical benefits of the alliance. Huron assigned them responsibility for the Endymion Cluster, a resource-rich region that provided the chapter with much-needed supplies and recruitment worlds. This arrangement gave the Mantis Warriors a stake in maintaining the status quo of Huron's regime. The Executioners proved more challenging to manipulate. Chapter Master Arkash Hakin respected Huron's martial prowess, but maintained a wary distance from his political ambitions. Huron secured their cooperation through a formal blood debt, invoking ancient traditions after Astral Claws forces aided the Executioners against Eldar raiders in 913. This bond of honor, while not ensuring the Executioners' political support, guaranteed their military cooperation within the framework of the Maelstrom Warders. By 914, the structure of the Maelstrom Warders had evolved from a loose coalition into a highly integrated command structure. Joint training exercises ensured tactical compatibility between the chapters. Combined fleet actions allowed for resource sharing and coordinated deployments. Intelligence gathered by one chapter was systematically shared with all Warders' forces through a network of communication hubs established throughout the Maelstrom Zone. This integration extended to logistics as well. The Astral Claws artificers shared advanced production techniques with their counterparts in the allied chapters. Forge facilities on Badab Primaris produced specialized equipment for all Warders' forces. Joint apothecarian protocols were established, ostensibly to address geneseed purity concerns, but effectively giving Huron's chief apothecaries insight into the genetic legacy of the allied chapters. The most significant development in this period was Huron's creation of the Tyrant's Legion, a fighting force that blurred the line between Astartes and mortal troops. Drawing from the planetary defense forces of Badab and other worlds in the sector, these units were organized along Space Marine lines, but comprised primarily of unaugmented humans. They were led by Astral Claws officers, equipped with superior wargear, and trained to operate alongside Astartes in combined arms formations. The Tyrant's Legion represented a direct violation of the post-heresy reforms that had separated the Adeptus Astartes from control of human military forces. By 915, these forces numbered in the tens of thousands, a substantial army that answered only to Huron. Their existence was carefully concealed from Imperial inspectors, with training facilities hidden in remote locations and equipment stockpiles disguised as planetary defense reserves. The financial foundation for Huron's growing military power came from systematic exploitation of the Badab sector's resources. Mining outputs were increased beyond sustainable levels. Manufactoria operated around the clock, their human workers subjected to harsh conditions and strict production quotas. Agricultural worlds were forced to implement intensive farming methods that maximized short-term yields at the cost of long-term soil viability. This resource extraction was justified to the sector's population as necessary for their protection. Huron's propaganda depicted the Imperium as distant and uncaring, interested only in collecting tithes, while leaving frontier worlds vulnerable to the predations of xenos and heretics. The Astral Claws and their allies were portrayed as the true defenders of humanity, standing firm against the horrors of the Maelstrom when Terra would not. This narrative found fertile ground among a population that had indeed suffered from xenos raids and felt neglected by distant Imperial authorities. Monuments to Astral Claws' victories were erected in major population centers. Public ceremonies honored the chapter's fallen heroes. Children were taught to revere the Tyrant of Badab as their protector and to view the Administratum's tithe collectors as parasites seeking to drain their worlds of resources needed for defense. By the year 917 of the 41st millennium, the situation had reached a critical juncture. The Adeptus Terra, frustrated by years of delays, excuses, and outright defiance, prepared to take more direct action. The Carthan incident could no longer be dismissed as an isolated event. Reports from neighboring sectors indicated that Huron's influence was spreading beyond the Maelstrom Zone. Most concerning, intelligence suggested the Astral Claws were engaging in unauthorized genetic experimentation with their gene seed, potentially threatening the purity of their chapter's genetic legacy. A formal conclave was convened on Terra to address what was now being called the Badab problem. Representatives from the Administratum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Inquisition, and the Adeptus Astartes debated the appropriate response. Some advocated for immediate military action to bring Huron to heel. Others suggested diplomatic approaches, fearing that direct confrontation with 4 Astartes chapters would lead to a bloody civil war with no clear winner. The final decision, reached after months of deliberation, was to send a formal delegation to Badab Primaris with the authority to audit the Astral Claws gene seed repositories, inspect their chapter strength, and review their compliance with Imperial tithes. This delegation would be led by an Inquisitor Lord and accompanied by representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Administratum. To ensure their safety and lend weight to their authority, a strike cruiser from the Marines' errant chapter would escort them to Badab. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either bring Huron back into the Imperial fold or push him irrevocably into open rebellion. The seeds of heresy, planted years earlier in the fertile soil of ambition and nurtured by pride, were about to bear their bitter fruit. The fortress world of Badab Primaris stood as the crown jewel in Lufgt Huron's growing empire, a planet transformed from a mere chapter homeworld into one of the most formidable military installations in the sector. Originally established as the Astral Claws base of operations centuries earlier, Badab Primaris had evolved under Huron's guidance into something far more significant, a virtually impregnable stronghold that would become the centerpiece of his rebellion. Situated in a strategically vital location near several stable warp routes that skirted the edges of the Maelstrom, Badab Primaris controlled access to numerous resource-rich systems. The planet itself was a world of stark contrasts, vast, barren plains of black volcanic rock interspersed with mountain ranges rich in strategic minerals. Its atmosphere, while technically breathable to humans, contained trace elements toxic enough to require filtration systems for extended exposure, creating a natural barrier to casual visitors. The Astral Claws Fortress Monastery, known as the Palace of Thorns, dominated the northern hemisphere. What had once been a relatively standard Astartes fortress had been expanded under Huron's direction into a sprawling complex covering nearly 200 square kilometers. Multiple concentric rings of fortifications surrounded the central keep, each layer incorporating defense technologies from different eras of Imperial history. Ancient void shields salvaged from decommissioned battleships alternated with more modern graviton repulsion fields. Gun emplacements ranging from quad-linked heavy bolters to macro cannon batteries capable of engaging targets in low orbit were positioned at strategic intervals. Deep beneath the Palace of Thorns lay a network of bunkers, armories, and manufactoria that extended kilometers into Badab's crust. These subterranean facilities housed enough supplies and munitions to sustain the Astral Claws through years of siege. Plasma reactors, many of them utilizing archaeotech components of uncertain origin, provided virtually unlimited power. Automated production lines churned out everything from bolt rounds to power armor components without requiring significant human oversight. The civilian infrastructure of Badab Primaris had been militarized as thoroughly as its chapter fortress. The planet's 3 major hive cities, originally mining centers established to extract the world's mineral wealth, had been transformed into fortified bastions. Their populations, numbering in the tens of millions, were organized into labor battalions that worked in shifts to maintain the planet's war industries. Children underwent mandatory combat training from the age of 6, creating a population where every citizen was also a potential soldier. Orbital defenses around Badab Primaris represented some of the most comprehensive fortifications outside of major segmentum naval bases. 3 massive star forts, each large enough to dock multiple capital ships, formed the primary defensive layer. Between these anchor points floated hundreds of smaller defense platforms, ranging from automated weapons satellites to manned stations housing thousands of crew. The combined firepower of these defenses could theoretically repel a battle fleet, creating a nearly impenetrable screen around the planet. The secession of Badab Primaris began not with a dramatic declaration, but with a calculated administrative action. In late 917, as the Terra-sanctioned delegation prepared to depart for the Badab sector, Huron implemented what he termed a security quarantine around his domain. Citing intelligence reports of potential infiltration attempts by hostile agents, he ordered the Astral Claws fleet to establish checkpoints at all warp entry points to the sector. Any vessel attempting to enter Badab space would be subjected to boarding and inspection by Astral Claws personnel. This quarantine effectively sealed off the Badab sector from Imperial oversight without technically declaring independence. Huron's communications with Imperial authorities remained outwardly respectful, filled with assurances that the measures were temporary and necessary for security. He even invited the approaching delegation to submit their travel plans for expedited processing through the quarantine, a thinly veiled attempt to control their movements and prepare for their arrival. The delegation, led by Inquisitor Lord Abraxas Frayne, reached the edge of Badab space in early 918. Their escort, the Marines' errant strike cruiser Sword of Justice, was immediately challenged by an Astral Claws patrol consisting of the strike cruiser Fire of Heaven and 2 escort frigates. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly 3 days, with neither side willing to fire the first shot but both refusing to yield. The impasse broke when Huron himself made contact from the Astral Claws flagship Acrusia, which had quietly moved into position behind the Marines' errant vessel. In a transmission notable for its cold formality, Huron informed Inquisitor Frayne that current security protocols prevented the delegation from proceeding to Badab Primaris. He suggested instead that the Inquisitor and a small party could transfer to an Astral Claws vessel for transport to a neutral meeting location elsewhere in the sector. Frayne, recognizing the implied threat and unwilling to place himself at Huron's mercy, declined the offer and ordered a withdrawal. As the Marines' errant vessel turned to leave, Astral Claws gunships executed a series of provocatively close passes, recording picked captures of the ship from multiple angles, a clear message that they had cataloged its defensive capabilities for future reference. Upon the delegation's return to Imperial space, Inquisitor Frayne filed a formal report declaring Lufgt Huron in contempt of Imperial authority. This report, combined with the increasingly troubling intelligence gathered over the previous years, finally prompted decisive action from Terra. The High Lords issued a formal demand for Huron to present himself on Terra to answer for his actions, giving him a deadline of 100 days to comply. Huron's response came on the 99th day, delivered via a recorded message rather than a live transmission, a precaution against tracking or identification of his location. Standing before a plain black backdrop that revealed nothing of his surroundings, the Tyrant of Badab formally declared the independence of the Badab Protectorate from what he termed the corrupt and ineffectual bureaucracy that has betrayed the Emperor's true vision. In his 30-minute address, Huron laid out a comprehensive indictment of imperial governance, citing specific instances where administratum policies had left frontier worlds vulnerable to xenos attacks. He referenced the Imperium's failure to provide adequate resources for the defense of the Maelstrom Zone despite its strategic importance. Most provocatively, he questioned whether the High Lords of Terra truly represented the Emperor's will, suggesting that the Adeptus Astartes, created directly by the Emperor's hand, had a more legitimate claim to leadership than scribes and accountants who have never seen battle. The declaration was carefully crafted to avoid any hint of chaos influence or religious heresy. Huron repeatedly affirmed his devotion to the Emperor and presented his actions as an attempt to fulfill the Emperor's original vision rather than oppose it. This framing was clearly designed to appeal to other Space Marine chapters who might harbor similar frustrations with Imperial bureaucracy while avoiding the taint of outright heresy that would unite potential allies against him. Within hours of Huron's declaration, Astral Claws forces moved to secure key Imperial assets throughout the Badab sector. The Administratum's primary tithe collection facility on Badab Secundus was seized by elements of the chapter's third company, its staff given the choice between swearing allegiance to the Protectorate or immediate deportation. Similar operations targeted Adeptus Astartes precincts, astropathic relay stations, and Mechanicus enclaves across multiple worlds. These takeovers were executed with precision and minimal bloodshed, a testament to months of careful planning. Huron had identified exactly which facilities needed to be controlled to maintain his grip on the sector, and had assigned specific forces to each target. In most cases, the Imperial personnel surrendered without resistance, having been isolated from outside communication and presented with overwhelming force. The most significant prize was the Sentinel-class station Sagan's Reach, which housed the sector's primary long-range astropathic choir. By controlling this facility, Huron gained the ability to monitor and filter all psychic communications entering or leaving Badab space. The station's 23 astropaths were placed under house arrest, confined to their quarters, and only permitted to send or receive messages under direct Astral Claws supervision. With his borders secured and internal opposition neutralized, Huron turned his attention to strengthening Badab Primaris against the Imperial response he knew would come. The planet's orbital defenses, already formidable, were enhanced with additional weapons platforms salvaged from decommissioned vessels. Ground-based lance batteries, originally designed for void ships, were modified for planetary defense and installed in hardened bunkers across the surface. The Tyrant's Legion, Huron's hybrid force of Astartes-led human troops, was expanded dramatically. Elite units were equipped with carapace armor and hellguns requisitioned from Administratum armories that had previously stored equipment destined for Imperial Guard regiments. Training cadres of Astral Claws sergeants drilled these forces relentlessly, preparing them to fight alongside full Astartes in integrated battle groups. Perhaps most concerning to distant Imperial observers was Huron's acceleration of his chapter's expansion beyond Codex-approved limits. The restrictions that had previously kept this growth somewhat concealed were abandoned. Recruitment from worlds throughout the sector increased tenfold, with aspirants subjected to an abbreviated selection process that prioritized quantity over quality. The implantation procedures were similarly compressed, accepting higher failure rates in exchange for more rapid production of new Astartes. This accelerated recruitment created hundreds of additional Space Marines over the next several years, though many displayed concerning physical or psychological abnormalities due to the rushed procedures. These marked Astartes were organized into separate companies under the direct command of Huron's most trusted lieutenants, kept apart from the rest of the chapter except during major operations. The Astral Claws apothecarian facilities were expanded to support this growth, with new geneseed cultivation chambers constructed in fortified bunkers beneath the Palace of Thorns. Reports from defectors suggested that Huron's chief apothecary, Garion, had implemented experimental procedures to accelerate geneseed maturation, potentially compromising the genetic stability of newly created Astartes. While Huron secured his position on Badab Primaris, the Inquisition launched a comprehensive investigation into his activities and connections. Inquisitor Frayne, now elevated to the rank of Lord Inquisitor and given extraordinary authority to address the Badab crisis, established a specialized task force comprising agents from multiple ordos. Their primary mission was to determine whether Huron's rebellion stemmed from political ambition alone, or if darker influences were at work. The investigation faced significant challenges. The Maelstrom Zone had always been difficult to monitor due to warp disturbances interfering with astropathic communications. With Huron now actively blocking information flow, the Inquisition was forced to rely on indirect sources, refugees fleeing the sector, traders who had visited before the quarantine, and long-range auger scans of ship movements near the borders. The Administratum's response to the secession was predictably bureaucratic. Multiple committees were formed to assess the economic impact of losing the Badab sector's resources. Tithe projections for neighboring sectors were revised upward to compensate for the shortfall. Administratum functionaries debated endlessly over whether Huron's declaration legally invalidated existing resource allocation agreements or merely suspended them temporarily. This administrative paralysis frustrated the more action-oriented elements of the Imperium, particularly the Space Marine chapters with historic ties to the region. The Fire Hawks, who had clashed with the Astral Claws in the past over jurisdictional matters, petitioned the High Lords for authorization to launch an immediate punitive expedition. The Marines Errant, whose vessel had been directly challenged by Huron's forces, similarly advocated for swift military action. The Mechanicus representatives on Terra took a particular interest in the Badab situation due to concerns about the Astral Claws gene-seed experimentation. The Magos biologists presented evidence suggesting that Huron's chapter might be attempting to modify their genetic heritage, potentially creating a divergent strain that could threaten the purity of the Emperor's design. This biological heresy, in the Mechanicus view, represented a far more serious offense than mere political rebellion. As the Administratum deliberated and the Inquisition investigated, Huron continued to strengthen his position. The Tyrant of Badab had transformed his chapter homeworld into the centerpiece of a secessionist domain, one that possessed the military power to challenge Imperial authority in ways not seen since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. The stage was set for a conflict that would draw in multiple Space Marine chapters and test the Imperium's ability to maintain control over its far-flung domains. The Imperium's response to Huron's secession began in earnest when the Fire Hawks chapter, led by their formidable chapter master Stibber Lazarek, received authorization for limited intervention in 904. Lazarek, a veteran commander known for his uncompromising adherence to Imperial doctrine, had long harbored suspicions about Huron's activities in the Maelstrom Zone. The Fire Hawks maintained a fortress monastery aboard the massive star Fortress Raptorus Rex, a mobile bastion that allowed them to project power across multiple sectors without maintaining a conventional homeworld. Lazarek's initial approach was cautious but deliberate. Rather than directly challenging the Astral Claws' stronghold on Badab Primaris, he deployed his forces to secure the outlying systems of the Badab sector, establishing a containment perimeter that would prevent Huron from expanding his influence further. The Fire Hawks fleet, comprising 3 battle barges and 11 strike cruisers, represented a substantial naval force that effectively matched the Astral Claws' fleet strength. The first major engagement of what would later be formally designated the Badab War came at the Battle of Galen in late 904. The Galen system, located at a strategic juncture of warp routes connecting the Badab sector to neighboring Imperial territories, housed an important refueling station and monitoring post. Huron had dispatched elements of the Astral Claws' 4th Company aboard the strike cruiser Hyrcania to secure the system and establish advanced warning posts against Imperial incursions. The Fire Hawks, having received intelligence about the Astral Claws' movements from loyalist elements within the sector, prepared an ambush. Chapter Master Lazarek personally led the operation aboard his flagship, the ancient battle barge Firestorm, accompanied by the strike cruisers Raptor's Wrath and Absolute. The Fire Hawks vessels translated from the warp at carefully calculated coordinates that placed them on the far side of Galen 4, using the planet's bulk to mask their approach from the Astral Claws' auger arrays. When the Hyrcania moved into position to deploy its ground forces to the Galen monitoring station, the Fire Hawks executed a perfectly coordinated pincer movement. The Firestorm and Absolute emerged from behind Galen 4, while the Raptor's Wrath approached from the system's outer reaches, where it had been lying dormant with minimal power signatures. The Astral Claws vessel, caught completely by surprise, found itself surrounded and outgunned. The naval engagement that followed demonstrated the Fire Hawks' tactical acumen. Rather than opening with a devastating barrage that might have destroyed the Hyrcania outright, Lazarek ordered precision strikes against the vessel's engines and weapon systems. Lance batteries from the Firestorm carved through the Hyrcania's drive section, leaving the strike cruiser adrift and unable to maneuver. Simultaneously, the Raptor's Wrath targeted the enemy vessel's dorsal weapons batteries with carefully calibrated bombardment cannon fire, systematically neutralizing its offensive capabilities. With the Hyrcania effectively crippled, Lazarek transmitted a demand for immediate surrender, offering quarter to the Astral Claws if they would renounce their allegiance to Huron and submit to Imperial authority. The response came in the form of a spread of boarding torpedoes launched from the Hyakania's ventral tubes, a defiant last act from a vessel that could no longer escape. The boarding action that followed was brutal and close-quartered. Firehawk's Terminators from the elite First Company teleported directly to the Hyakania's bridge, while tactical squads deployed from Thunderhawk gunships to secure the engine decks and weapons control centers. The Astral Claws fought with the determination of warriors who expected no mercy, employing improvised barricades and deliberately collapsing internal bulkheads to channel the Firehawks into prepared kill zones. After 6 hours of room-by-room fighting, the Firehawks secured control of the Hyakania. Of the 97 Astral Claws aboard, only 12 survived to be taken prisoner. The Firehawks suffered 38 casualties, including the loss of veteran Sergeant Tyrant, a decorated officer who had served with distinction for over 2 centuries. The captured Astral Claws were transported to the Raptorus Rex for interrogation by Chaplain Ivanis Nkomi, a specialist in extracting information from recalcitrant subjects. The intelligence gathered from these prisoners provided the first concrete evidence of Huron's extensive preparations for rebellion. Data slates recovered from the Hyakania's cogitator core revealed supply cache locations, communication protocols, and most significantly, a comprehensive order of battle that confirmed the Astral Claws had indeed expanded far beyond Codex-approved strength. The Battle of Galen represented more than just a tactical victory for the Firehawks. It served as a clear signal to the wider Imperium that Huron's actions constituted a genuine threat, requiring a coordinated response. Lazarek compiled a detailed report of the engagement, including the evidence recovered from the Hyakania, and transmitted it directly to Segmentum Command and the High Lords of Terra. The response from Terra came in the form of Inquisitor Lord Freyne's formal investiture with extraordinary authority to address the Badab crisis. Freyne, recognizing that the situation required substantial military force beyond what his inquisitorial retinue could provide, convened a council of war aboard the Raptorus Rex in early 905. This gathering brought together representatives from several Space Marine chapters with interests in the region, as well as senior officers from Battlefleet Scarus and the Imperial Navy. The Council established a formal command structure for what was now officially designated as a suppression campaign against secessionist elements in the Badab sector. While Inquisitor Lord Freyne retained overall strategic authority as the Emperor's direct representative, operational command of military forces was assigned to Chapter Master Lazarek, whose Fire Hawks would form the backbone of the Loyalist coalition. The Marines errant, still smarting from their confrontation with Astral Claws forces at the sector border, committed 5 full companies to the campaign. Their chapter master, Beckett, designated Commander Isaiah as his representative in the War Council. The Marines errant brought valuable assets to the coalition, including their specialized void warfare expertise and a comprehensive knowledge of the sector's navigational hazards from their previous patrol duties. The Red Scorpions, though initially reluctant to become involved in what Lord Commander Varant Ortiz described as a political matter, ultimately committed substantial forces after reviewing the evidence of Huron's genetic experimentation. The chapter's obsession with genetic purity made the Astral Claws tampering with geneseed particularly abhorrent to them. Ortiz dispatched Force Commander Karab Kuln with 3 companies and the battle barge Sword of Orden to join the Loyalist coalition. The formation of this Loyalist alliance transformed what might have remained a limited engagement into a full-scale Imperial campaign. By mid-905, the combined forces of the Fire Hawks, Marines Errant, and Red Scorpions, supported by elements of Battlefleet Scarus and various inquisitorial assets, represented a formidable military force. The coalition established its primary base of operations at the Galen system, now secured as a staging area for further incursions into Huron's territory. Huron's response to the Battle of Galen and the formation of the Loyalist coalition was swift and calculated. Rather than attempting to recapture the Galen system, he ordered a strategic redeployment of his forces to create defense in depth. The outer systems of the Badab sector were largely abandoned, their resources and key personnel evacuated to more defensible positions closer to Badab Primaris. This approach sacrificed territory, but preserved Huron's military strength for engagements on more favorable terms. The Tyrant also activated his network of allies within the Maelstrom Warders. The Mantis warriors, responding to Huron's call for support, deployed their fleet to secure the Endymion cluster, establishing a buffer zone between loyalist forces and the core worlds of Huron's domain. The Lamenters similarly moved to protect the rimward approaches to Badab, their substantial fleet assets positioning themselves to threaten the flank of any loyalist advance. The Executioners, bound by their blood debt to Huron, reluctantly deployed forces to reinforce key strategic locations, though they notably avoided direct confrontation with loyalist space marines where possible. The naval dimension of the conflict intensified throughout the year 905 of the 41st millennium, as both sides attempted to secure control of the void lanes connecting the disparate star systems of the Badab sector. The Fire Hawks fleet, reinforced by Marines' errant strike cruisers and Red Scorpions vessels, conducted a series of probing actions against the defensive perimeters established by the secessionist forces. These engagements rarely developed into major fleet battles, instead consisting of brief, violent clashes between reconnaissance elements and picket ships. One notable exception came in the Vaiania asteroid belt, where a Marines' errant patrol consisting of the strike cruiser Blade of the Emperor and 2 escort frigates encountered a substantial Mantis warriors force led by the battle barge Eternal Vigilance. The ensuing engagement demonstrated the tactical flexibility of both chapters. The Marines' errant vessels used the dense asteroid field to mask their movements, executing a series of hit-and-run attacks that gradually wore down the larger Mantis warriors' vessels. The Mantis warriors responded with disciplined formation flying that maximized their overlapping fields of fire, effectively creating a mobile fortress that the Marines' errant struggled to penetrate. After 4 hours of maneuvering through the treacherous asteroid field, both sides withdrew with moderate damage, but no decisive advantage gained. This inconclusive result typified the early naval engagements of the conflict, neither side willing to commit their full strength until they had better assessed their opponent's capabilities and intentions. The ground war developed more slowly, with both loyalists and secessionists reluctant to commit to major planetary assaults that would inevitably result in high casualties. Instead, the early months of the conflict saw numerous small-scale actions focused on securing strategic assets such as communications relays, supply depots, and monitoring stations. These operations typically involved company-sized formations or smaller, often supported by specialized units such as scout squads or Terminator veterans, depending on the specific mission parameters. One significant ground engagement occurred on the mining world of Signax, where intelligence indicated the Astral Claws had established a substantial supply cache in the abandoned lower levels of Hive Eternus. Force Commander Kuln led elements of the Red Scorpion's 1st and 3rd companies in a precision strike against this target, deploying via Thunderhawk gunships under the cover of a severe electromagnetic storm that reduced the effectiveness of the defenders' auger arrays. The Red Scorpion's approach to urban warfare emphasized methodical advance and overwhelming firepower. Tactical squads moved through the cramped corridors of the Hive's lower levels in tight formation, their advance preceded by concentrated fire from heavy bolters and plasma weapons that eliminated resistance before close combat could develop. When the defenders, primarily human troops of the Tyrant's Legion supported by a small contingent of Astral Claws, attempted to mount a coordinated counterattack, they were met by the devastating firepower of Devastator squads strategically positioned at key junctions. The operation succeeded in securing substantial quantities of munitions, power cells, and medical supplies intended for secessionist forces. More importantly, cogitator records captured during the raid provided valuable intelligence about supply lines and logistics networks throughout the sector, information that would prove crucial for planning future operations. As the year 905 drew to a close, the pattern of the conflict had been established. The Loyalist forces, operating from their secure base at Galen, conducted a series of limited strikes against outlying systems, while gradually tightening their blockade of Huron's territory. The secessionist forces, meanwhile, focused on fortifying their core worlds and disrupting Loyalist supply lines through asymmetric warfare. Neither side had yet committed to the type of major engagement that might decisively alter the course of the war. The combined operations of the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant, and Fire Hawks demonstrated increasing coordination as the campaign progressed. Joint training exercises conducted in the Galen system allowed the three chapters to develop standardized communication protocols and tactical doctrines that accommodated their different combat philosophies. The Fire Hawks' aggressive shock assault tactics complemented the methodical precision of the Red Scorpions, while the Marines Errant's void warfare expertise provided crucial support for both. This growing cohesion was tested in early 906, when augur stations in the Galen system detected a substantial secessionist fleet approaching from the direction of the Endymion cluster. The force, comprising vessels from both the Mantis Warriors and Astral Claws chapters, appeared to be mounting a major counteroffensive aimed at dislodging the Loyalists from their forward base. The Mantis Warriors' decision to support Huron's cause stemmed from complex historical and strategic considerations that predated the Badab War by centuries. As custodians of the Endymion cluster, a region of space containing 27 inhabited worlds spread across 19 star systems, the Mantis Warriors had developed a fierce protective instinct toward these frontier settlements. The chapter's fortress monastery, Thika, occupied an entire moon orbiting the death world of Tranquility, a planet of dense jungles and predatory fauna that provided an ideal recruiting ground for the chapter. Under the leadership of Chapter Master Khoisan Neodara, the Mantis Warriors had cultivated a reputation for patient observation followed by devastating ambushes. Their combat doctrine emphasized reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, with battle brothers often spending days in camouflaged positions studying enemy movements before striking. This approach earned them the nickname, the Waiting Death, among Imperial Guard regiments who had fought alongside them. The Mantis Warriors' power armor typically featured a distinctive green and yellow color scheme, often complemented by black markings that enhanced their camouflage capabilities. Many battle brothers adorned their armor with tribal fetishes and tokens collected from death worlds throughout the Endymion cluster, creating a unique aesthetic that blended Imperial technology with primitive symbolism. Their helmets frequently incorporated enhanced visual augurs that mimicked the compound eyes of the insects from which they took their name. The chapter's loyalty to Huron developed gradually through a series of carefully orchestrated interactions. Beginning around 903, Huron provided the Mantis Warriors with intelligence reports indicating increased xenos activity near the Maelstrom, particularly focusing on threats to the Endymion cluster. These reports, while based on actual incidents, were selectively presented to emphasize the Imperium's failure to adequately protect frontier worlds. Huron simultaneously increased Astral Claws patrols in regions bordering Mantis Warriors' territory, creating the impression that his chapter was shouldering an unfair burden of the cluster's defense. Khoisan Neodara, a proud but pragmatic leader, initially viewed Huron's overtures with skepticism. However, the tyrant's argument that the Endymion cluster required unified defense under Astartes' leadership resonated with the Mantis Warriors' existing concerns. When Huron formally established the Maelstrom Warders and offered the Mantis Warriors exclusive stewardship over the entire Endymion cluster, Neodara saw an opportunity to better fulfill his chapter's protective mission. The structure of the Mantis Warriors reflected their specialized approach to warfare. The chapter maintained a larger-than-typical scout company, with many battle brothers remaining in reconnaissance roles, even after receiving their full implants and power armor. Their 8th company specialized in void warfare, featuring an unusually high concentration of Terminator armor suits modified for zero-gravity operations. These specialized units gave the Mantis Warriors significant flexibility in defending the dispersed worlds of the Endymion cluster. The executioners' involvement in the Badab War represented perhaps the most reluctant participation among the secessionist chapters. Founded during the 25th founding, the executioners traced their lineage to the Imperial fists, but had developed a distinct warrior culture that emphasized personal honor and ritual combat. Their homeworld of Stygia Aquilon, a tidally locked planet of perpetual twilight, had shaped them into warriors who valued individual prowess and martial skill above tactical orthodoxy. Chapter Master Arkash Hakin, a giant of a space marine who stood a full head taller than most of his battle brothers, had initially maintained a careful distance from Huron's political machinations. The executioners' participation in the Maelstrom Wars had been primarily motivated by practical considerations. The Alliance provided them with access to resources and intelligence that benefited their ongoing campaigns against pirate forces operating from the Maelstrom. The pivotal moment came in 913, when an Astral Claws strike force, led by Captain Corian Sumatris, intervened during an executioner's operation against Eldar corsairs. The executioner's strike cruiser Blade of Perdition had suffered catastrophic damage after being ambushed by 3 Eldar vessels using holofield technology to mask their approach. With the ship's Geller field failing and a warp jump impossible, the situation appeared hopeless until the arrival of the Astral Claws battle barge Hyakania, which drove off the Eldar attackers and rescued the stranded executioners. According to the ancient traditions of the executioners, such an act created a blood debt that could only be repaid through equivalent service. Hakin, bound by his chapter's rigid honor code, formally pledged the executioners to Huron's cause through a ritual known as the Oath of Swords. This ceremony, conducted in the Great Obsidian Hall of the Astral Claws Fortress Monastery, involved the exchange of ceremonial power axes and the mixing of blood between Hakin and Huron, creating a bond that the executioners could not break without sacrificing their most fundamental cultural values. The executioners' combat doctrine emphasized close-quarters fighting and individual combat prowess. Unlike most Codex-compliant chapters, they organized their companies around specific weapon specializations rather than tactical roles. The most elite warriors formed the Death Axes, veterans who wielded master-crafted power axes and typically deployed as shock troops in the most challenging engagements. Their armor, predominantly black with bone-white helmets and shoulder pads, frequently incorporated trophies taken from worthy opponents, skulls, severed hands, or personal weapons mounted as grisly decorations. Despite their formal allegiance to Huron, the executioners maintained a degree of operational independence throughout the early stages of the Badab War. Hakin insisted that his warriors would not raise their weapons against other Space Marines except in direct self-defense, a stipulation that Huron reluctantly accepted. This arrangement allowed the executioners to focus primarily on engaging Imperial Navy vessels and guard units while avoiding direct confrontation with loyalist Astartes where possible. The Lamenters represented the most tragic case among the secessionist chapters. Created during the cursed 21st founding, the chapter had endured centuries of misfortune and prejudice due to their flawed gene seed. Despite these challenges, the Lamenters had compiled an exemplary service record, repeatedly demonstrating their loyalty to the Imperium through acts of self-sacrifice. Their chapter's symbol, a bleeding heart on a black background, perfectly encapsulated their melancholic yet noble character. Chapter Master Malakim Foros, a battle-scarred veteran whose once handsome features had been ravaged by centuries of warfare, had led the Lamenters through some of their darkest trials. Under his leadership, the chapter had been reduced to barely half strength following their near destruction during the Corinth Crusade, where they had lost over 300 battle brothers fighting against Orc forces. The subsequent century had been spent slowly rebuilding their numbers while continuing to serve the Imperium despite receiving minimal support from other Imperial institutions. The Lamenters' decision to join Huron's cause stemmed from a complex mixture of pragmatism and bitter experience. Having repeatedly seen their sacrifices go unrecognized by Imperial authorities, Foros found Huron's arguments about Astartes' autonomy increasingly persuasive. The tyrant offered the Lamenters something they had long been denied: respect, and material support, without the stigma that typically accompanied their cursed founding. When Huron provided the chapter with access to advanced medici facilities on Badab Primaris to help address their gene seed degradation issues, Foros felt he had no choice but to support the man who had shown his beleaguered chapter such unprecedented consideration. The Lamenter's combat doctrine emphasized flexibility and adaptability, necessary traits for a chapter that frequently operated below optimal strength. Their battle brothers trained extensively in multiple combat roles, allowing tactical squads to smoothly transition between assault, fire support, and objective holding functions as battlefield conditions changed. This versatility made them particularly effective in Zone Mortalis engagements, where their ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances proved invaluable. Their armor, painted a distinctive yellow with black and white checkered patterns on the shoulder pads, made them easily identifiable on the battlefield. Unlike many chapters that proudly displayed battle damage, the Lamenters meticulously maintained their wargear, believing that proper respect for their equipment honored the sacrifices of fallen brothers whose gear they had inherited. This practice gave even veteran Lamenters a surprisingly pristine appearance that belied their extensive combat experience. The strategic deployment of these three secessionist chapters demonstrated Huron's tactical acumen. Rather than concentrating his allies in a single defensive line, he assigned each chapter responsibilities that aligned with their particular strengths. The Mantis warriors secured the Endymion cluster, creating a buffer zone that protected Badab from approach along multiple vectors. Their expertise in guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics made them ideally suited for denying these systems to loyalist forces without requiring large-scale garrison deployments. The executioners were primarily deployed to protect key void installations and shipping lanes within Huron's domain. Their fleet, comprising 3 battle barges and 11 strike cruisers, represented a substantial naval force that effectively countered the void superiority of the loyalist chapters. Haken positioned his vessels at strategic choke points where warp routes converged, allowing them to intercept loyalist reinforcements and supply convoys, while minimizing direct confrontation with other Astartes. The Lamenters took responsibility for the rimward approaches to Badab, where their adaptability proved crucial in responding to the diverse threats presented by loyalist probing actions. Chapter Master Foros established a mobile defense perimeter, keeping the bulk of his forces in reserve while deploying small, elite units to gather intelligence on loyalist movements. This approach allowed the Lamenters to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated loyalist elements while avoiding major engagements that might deplete their limited numbers. The combined void assets of the secessionist chapters represented a formidable naval force. The Astral Claws contributed 2 battle barges and at least 12 strike cruisers, supplemented by numerous smaller vessels. The Mantis warriors added another battle barge and 9 strike cruisers, while the executioners and Lamenters provided similar numbers. In total, the secessionist fleet comprised approximately 8 battle barges and 40 strike cruisers, along with dozens of escort vessels and support craft, a force that could challenge even substantial battle fleet deployments. This naval strength allowed Huron to implement a layered defense strategy. The outer perimeter, maintained primarily by the allied chapters, focused on intelligence gathering and selective engagement of loyalist forces. Behind this screen, the Astral Claws fleet operated as a rapid reaction force, ready to reinforce threatened sectors or exploit opportunities created by successful ambushes. The innermost defensive layer around Badab Primaris itself consisted of heavily armed space stations and defense platforms that could support the mobile elements if forced to fall back to the chapter homeworld. Coordination between the secessionist chapters presented significant challenges due to their diverse combat doctrines and cultural differences. The Mantis warriors' preference for patient observation and precisely timed strikes contrasted sharply with the executioners' emphasis on direct confrontation and individual combat prowess. The Lamenters' flexible approach sometimes clashed with the more rigid tactical frameworks employed by the other chapters, creating friction during joint operations. Huron addressed these challenges by establishing a sophisticated command structure that balanced centralized strategic direction with decentralized tactical execution. Each chapter retained operational control over its forces, with Huron providing overall strategic guidance rather than direct orders. Weekly command conferences, conducted via secure Vox link when distance prevented physical gatherings, allowed the chapter masters to coordinate their efforts while preserving their autonomy. This arrangement proved particularly important for maintaining the executioner's support, as Haken would likely have withdrawn from the alliance if subjected to direct command from another chapter master. By respecting the executioner's traditions and allowing them to fulfill their blood debt according to their own cultural practices, Huron kept a powerful ally that might otherwise have abandoned his cause. The secessionist chapters combined strength at the outbreak of hostilities, included approximately 1,500 Astral Claws, 800 Mantis Warriors, 700 Lamenters, and 900 Executioners. This force of nearly 4,000 Astartes represented one of the largest concentrations of space marine power outside of major Imperial crusades. When combined with the tens of thousands of human troops in the Tyrant's Legion, Huron commanded a formidable military force capable of challenging even determined Imperial efforts to restore control over the Badab sector. As the conflict escalated from isolated skirmishes to coordinated campaigns, the distinctive combat doctrines of the secessionist chapters became increasingly apparent. The Mantis warriors excelled at ambush operations, using their intimate knowledge of the Endymion cluster's geography to lure loyalist forces into carefully prepared killing zones. A typical Mantis warrior's operation began with the deployment of scout squads days or even weeks before expected enemy arrival, establishing observation posts and targeting arrays throughout the engagement area. The Siege of Signax marked a turning point in the Badab War, transforming what had been a series of limited engagements into a full-scale conflict characterized by increasing brutality on both sides. The mining world of Signax, with its vast underground complexes and valuable mineral deposits, had become a flashpoint after initial Red Scorpion's operations uncovered substantial Astral Claws supply caches. In mid-906, Lufgt Huron determined that reclaiming this strategic asset would demonstrate the secessionists' resolve while securing much-needed resources. The Astral Claws launched their counteroffensive with characteristic precision. 3 strike cruisers, the Hyakania, the Salvation, and the Intemperate, translated from the warp at the system's edge, using the debris field of a shattered moon to mask their approach from loyalist augur arrays. Aboard these vessels, the Astral Claws' 3rd and 5th companies prepared for planetary assault, supported by elite elements from the Tyrant's Legion, including 4 cohorts of augmented human troops. Firehawks Chapter Master Stibber Lazarek, receiving reports of the secessionist fleet's arrival, immediately dispatched the battle barge Raptorous Spear under the command of Captain Pelazmir to reinforce the Firehawks contingent already stationed on Signax. The Raptorous Spear carried the Firehawks' 2nd Company, veterans of dozens of boarding actions and planetary assaults, equipped with an unusually high concentration of Terminator armor suits and heavy support weapons. The battle began in the void above Signax. The Astral Claws vessels, detecting the approaching loyalist reinforcements, adjusted their trajectory to intercept the Raptorous Spear before it could reach orbit. The resulting naval engagement demonstrated the tactical flexibility of both forces. The Astral Claws strike cruisers adopted a triangular formation that maximized their overlapping fields of fire, focusing their lance batteries on the Raptorous Spear's propulsion systems in an attempt to cripple the larger vessel. Captain Mir responded with a daring maneuver, using the battle barge's superior armor to absorb the initial barrage while closing to optimal range for its dorsal bombardment cannons. The Raptorous Spear's first salvo struck the Salvation with devastating effect, collapsing its void shields and breaching its command deck. With one opponent severely damaged, Mir executed a rolling turn that brought the battle barge's broadside batteries to bear on the remaining Astral Claws vessels. The naval battle lasted nearly 4 hours, with both sides suffering significant damage. The Salvation was eventually crippled, its reactor containment fields failing and forcing the crew to abandon ship. The Hyakania and Intemperate sustained moderate damage, but succeeded in their primary mission, deploying their troops to the surface, while the Firehawks were occupied in the void engagement. On the surface of Signax, the situation rapidly deteriorated for the Loyalist forces. The Firehawks' 4th Company, which had been conducting security operations in the primary mining complex of Hive Argus, found themselves facing a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Astral Claws drop pods targeted the Hive's upper levels, while Thunderhawk gunships delivered Terminator squads to the main processing facilities in the mid-levels. Simultaneously, Tyrant's Legion troops emerged from the lower mining tunnels, having infiltrated through abandoned passages days earlier. Captain Erastus, commanding the Firehawks forces on Signax, ordered his companies to consolidate their position in the central administrative district. This defensive perimeter, centered around the massive Administratum complex, offered commanding fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. Tactical squads established interlocking fields of fire from reinforced hab blocks, while Devastator teams positioned heavy weapons at key intersections. The Astral Claws advanced methodically, securing each section of the Hive before moving forward. Captain Corian Sumatris, leading the assault, employed a combined arms approach that leveraged the strengths of both Astartes and human troops. Tyrant's Legion cohorts secured secondary corridors and potential flanking routes, allowing the Astral Claws to concentrate their limited numbers on key breakthrough points. This approach minimized casualties while maintaining constant pressure on the defenders. As the battle entered its second day, the Firehawks' position became increasingly precarious. Ammunition for heavy weapons began running low, and casualties mounted as the Astral Claws brought up plasma cannons and multi-meltas to breach the reinforced defensive positions. Captain Erastus requested immediate reinforcement from the Raptorous Spear, which had finally secured void superiority after driving off the remaining Astral Claws vessels. The arrival of the Firehawks' 2nd Company should have shifted the momentum of the battle. Captain Mir led the relief force personally, deploying via Thunderhawk gunships to the upper levels of the administrative district. Their plan called for a pincer movement that would catch the Astral Claws between the fresh troops and the established defensive perimeter. What followed was one of the most devastating ambushes of the early war. As the 2nd Company advanced through the upper hab levels, they triggered a series of carefully placed melta-bombs that collapsed entire sections of the Hive structure. Dozens of Firehawks were crushed under thousands of tons of rockcrete and steel, while others found themselves isolated in pocket-sized kill zones. Simultaneously, previously concealed heavy weapons positions opened fire from prepared emplacements, catching the Loyalists in devastating crossfires. The ambush had been meticulously planned by Astral Claws Master of Ordnance Theros Justinian, who had studied the Firehawks' tactical doctrines and correctly anticipated their relief strategy. The explosive charges had been placed days earlier by infiltration teams disguised as maintenance servitors, their true nature concealed from routine auger scans by signal-dampening compounds developed in the Astral Claws' forbidden research facilities. Captain Mir, trapped with a command squad in a partially collapsed hab block, ordered the surviving elements of the 2nd Company to fight their way to the central defensive perimeter. Of the 97 Firehawks who had deployed from the Raptorous Spear, only 38 reached the Administratum complex. Captain Mir himself was among the casualties, his armor's power plant detonating after sustaining critical damage from a concentrated plasma barrage. With both the 2nd and 4th Companies severely depleted, Captain Erastus made the difficult decision to abandon Signax. The remaining Firehawks executed a fighting withdrawal to designated extraction points, covering the evacuation of wounded battle brothers and critical equipment. Thunderhawk gunships from the Raptorous Spear conducted extraction under heavy fire, several being shot down by Astral Claws anti-aircraft batteries that had been moved into position during the battle. The siege of Signax cost the Firehawks 249 battle brothers, nearly a quarter of their chapter strength, along with irreplaceable equipment, including 12 suits of Terminator armor and the ancient Contemptor dreadnought Invictus, whose sarcophagus was destroyed by a direct hit from a las cannon battery. The psychological impact of this defeat reverberated throughout the Loyalist coalition, demonstrating that the secessionists possessed both the tactical acumen and the material resources to challenge even experienced Space Marine chapters. Following the victory at Signax, Huron sought to capitalize on the momentum by launching what became known as the Tranquility Campaign, a series of coordinated operations aimed at breaking the Loyalist blockades that had begun to restrict movement between secessionist-controlled systems. The campaign centered on the Tranquility System in the Endymion cluster, where the Mantis warriors' fortress monastery Oothika provided a secure base for operations against Loyalist patrol routes. The Tranquility Campaign demonstrated the growing coordination between the secessionist chapters. Mantis warriors' reconnaissance units identified vulnerabilities in Loyalist patrol patterns, targeting isolated vessels and small battle groups. Lamenter's strike cruisers executed precision warp jumps to ambush these targets, engaging them just long enough for executioners' boarding parties to teleport onto the Loyalist vessels. Once the ships were secured, Astral Claws' technical teams would strip them of valuable equipment and intelligence before scuttling the hulks. This strategy proved remarkably effective, with 17 Loyalist vessels destroyed or captured in the first month of the campaign. The Marines errant, who had assumed primary responsibility for maintaining the blockade, found their fleet assets stretched to breaking point as they attempted to cover an expanding perimeter with diminishing resources. Commander Isaiah requested reinforcement from Battle Fleet Scarus, but the Imperial Navy, dealing with orc incursions elsewhere in the sector, could spare only a handful of escort vessels. The Tranquility Campaign reached its crescendo with the Battle of the Ember Gap, a narrow corridor of stable space between two warp storm fronts that served as a critical supply route for Loyalist forces. The Marines errant had established a checkpoint at this strategic chokepoint, with the strike cruiser Blade of the Emperor and 3 escort frigates monitoring all passing traffic. This small flotilla represented a critical vulnerability in the Loyalist blockade network, one that Huron was determined to exploit. The secessionist strike force comprised vessels from all 4 rebel chapters: the Astral Claws battle barge Cruja, commanded by Huron himself, the Lamenter's strike cruiser Mater Lacrimarum, the Executioner's Blade of Perdition, and 2 Mantis warriors light cruisers. This concentration of firepower overwhelmed the Loyalist checkpoint in a brief but intense engagement that left the Blade of the Emperor severely damaged and 2 of its escort frigates destroyed outright. With the Ember Gap secured, secessionist supply lines were temporarily restored, allowing the movement of resources and reinforcements between previously isolated systems. The Loyalists struggled to re-establish their blockade, hampered by the loss of vessels and the need to adopt more conservative patrol patterns to avoid similar ambushes. As the conflict intensified, both sides began committing acts that crossed the line from legitimate warfare into atrocity. The first major incident occurred on the agri-world of Chimera, where Tyrant's Legion forces had established a major supply depot supporting operations throughout the neighboring systems. Intelligence indicated minimal defenses, prompting the Red Scorpions to dispatch their 3rd company under Captain Varen to secure the facility. The initial assault proceeded according to plan, with Red Scorpions' drop pods landing directly on the primary storage facilities. The defenders, primarily Tyrant's Legion militia supported by a small contingent of Astral Claws, offered only token resistance before retreating into the surrounding agricultural complexes. Captain Varen, suspecting a trap similar to the one that had devastated the Firehawks on Signax, ordered his forces to secure their immediate perimeter rather than pursuing the retreating enemy. This caution proved justified when auger scans detected numerous hidden explosives throughout the complex, devices that would have inflicted severe casualties had the Red Scorpions advanced as expected. After neutralizing these threats, Varen's forces methodically cleared the surrounding structures, eventually cornering the remaining defenders in an administrative building at the edge of the complex. What followed would later be cited by secessionist propaganda as evidence of Loyalist brutality. Rather than accepting the surrender of the cornered militia troops, the Red Scorpions executed all 84 prisoners, including several unarmed administrative personnel. Force Commander Kuln later defended this action as necessary due to clear evidence of chaos corruption, allegedly found among the defenders, though independent verification of this claim was never provided. The most notorious incident of the early war occurred in the Chimeran Drift, where a Salamander's strike force led by Captain Pellas had been dispatched to investigate reports of secessionist fleet movements. The Salamander's strike cruiser Vulcan's Wrath encountered an executioner's patrol consisting of the strike cruiser Knight's Vigil and 2 escort vessels. Despite the Salamander's attempts to establish communication and identify themselves as uninvolved in the Badab conflict, the executioner's vessels opened fire without warning. The ensuing void battle ended with the Vulcan's Wrath crippled and boarded by executioner's Terminators. Captain Pellas and his command squad were captured along with 38 other Salamander's survivors. The prisoners were transported to the executioner's Fortress Monastery on Stygia Aquilon, where Chapter Master Haken declared they would be held until the conclusion of hostilities. 3 months later, a data crystal was delivered to the Salamander's Fortress Monastery on Nocturne. It contained picked captures documenting the ritual execution of Captain Pellas and his battle brothers. According to accompanying text, the executions had been carried out in accordance with ancient executioners' traditions after the prisoners allegedly attempted to escape. Each salamander had been beheaded with a ceremonial power axe, their gene seed harvested and stored rather than destroyed, a gesture the executioners considered honorable, but which the salamanders viewed as the ultimate desecration. This incident drew the previously neutral salamanders chapter into the conflict, with Chapter Master Tushan vowing to exact vengeance upon the executioners. The involvement of the salamanders significantly expanded the scope of the war, transforming it from a regional conflict into one with wider implications for the Imperium's stability. As the war escalated, evidence began emerging of darker influences affecting the Astral Claws. Inquisitorial investigations of captured secessionist equipment revealed subtle modifications to standard Imperial patterns, changes that incorporated forbidden technological principles, and in some cases, symbols associated with the ruinous powers. These modifications were particularly evident in the experimental weapons used by Huron's elite Terminator squads, which incorporated energy projection systems of unknown origin. More concerning were the reports from loyalist librarians who had faced Astral Claws forces in battle. Several described encountering unusual psychic phenomena when confronting Huron's elite troops, sensations of unnatural, cold, whispered voices at the edge of perception, and in one case, what appeared to be non-Mechanicus-sanctioned cybernetic enhancements that displayed capabilities beyond known Imperial technology. The most damning evidence came from the interrogation of a captured Astral Claws apothecary, who revealed under psychic questioning that Huron had established secret research facilities beneath his fortress monastery. These laboratories reportedly conducted experiments combining xenotech components with Imperial systems, and most alarmingly, explored methods of enhancing Astartes' capabilities through means explicitly forbidden by the Emperor during the Great Crusade. While this evidence remained circumstantial, it raised troubling questions about the true nature of Huron's rebellion. What had begun as a political dispute over resource allocation and chapter autonomy showed increasing signs of something more sinister, a corruption that threatened to transform the Badab War from a regrettable civil conflict into a genuine chaos incursion, requiring the most extreme Imperial response. As the year 907 of the 41st millennium drew to a close, the conflict had claimed thousands of lives on both sides, with no clear resolution in sight. The secessionists maintained control of their core territories, while the loyalists struggled to maintain their blockade in the face of increasingly effective secessionist counter-operations. The involvement of additional chapters expanded the war scope, transforming what might have been a localized rebellion into a conflict with implications for Astartes' autonomy throughout the Imperium. The arrival of the Star Phantoms in the year 908 of the 41st millennium marked a decisive shift in the Badab War's momentum. Unlike the previously committed Loyalist chapters, the Star Phantoms entered the conflict with no political agenda or territorial interests in the region. Their involvement stemmed solely from a direct request by the High Lords of Terra, who recognized the need for additional Astartes forces untainted by regional politics or personal vendettas. Under the command of Chapter Master Xenos Androcles, the Star Phantoms deployed their entire chapter fleet to the Galen system, including their formidable battle barge Memento Mori and 6 strike cruisers. The Star Phantoms' arrival immediately altered the strategic calculus of the conflict, their reputation for ruthless efficiency and detachment causing visible concern among secessionist commanders who had studied their combat record. The Star Phantoms' battle doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower applied with clinical precision. Their armor, predominantly bone white with black trim and silver detailing, presented a stark, ghostly appearance on the battlefield. Many battle brothers adorned their armor with Memento Mori symbols, hourglasses, skulls, and other reminders of mortality that reflected their chapter's fatalistic philosophy. Their combat approach eschewed the honor duels and martial challenges common among other chapters, instead focusing on the systematic elimination of targets through coordinated fire patterns and strategic positioning. Their first major engagement came at the mining colony of Iblis, where intelligence indicated the Mantis warriors had established a forward supply base. Rather than announcing their presence with the traditional drop pod assault favored by many chapters, the Star Phantoms inserted 5 full companies via high-altitude night drops, their specially modified power armor incorporating enhanced stealth systems that minimized their signature on auger arrays. The Mantis warriors' sentries, experts in ambush tactics themselves, detected the infiltration only minutes before the Star Phantoms initiated their attack. What followed was a masterclass in precision warfare. Star Phantoms' Devastator squads established overlapping fields of fire that systematically isolated sections of the Mantis warriors' perimeter. Tactical squads advanced in staggered formations that maximized fire lanes while minimizing exposure. Assault squads held in reserve until specific breakthrough points had been identified, then deployed with pinpoint accuracy to exploit these vulnerabilities. The battle lasted just under 7 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the Mantis warriors' supply base. Of the 87 Mantis warriors present, 63 were confirmed killed, with the remainder forced to withdraw under heavy fire. The Star Phantoms suffered only 12 casualties, a testament to their methodical approach and superior tactical positioning. More significant than the material losses was the psychological impact. The Mantis warriors, masters of stealth and ambush, had been outmaneuvered at their own game. The Star Phantoms' effectiveness stemmed partly from their unique organizational structure. Unlike most Codex-adherent chapters, they maintained specialized Morty's companies, trained specifically for void warfare and siege operations. These companies incorporated an unusually high concentration of heavy weapons and specialized equipment, including modified Terminator armor suits equipped with enhanced targeting systems. Their officers underwent additional training in complex fire pattern calculation and multi-unit coordination, allowing them to orchestrate devastating combined arms operations with mathematical precision. Following the success at Iblis, Chapter Master Androcles deployed his forces in a systematic campaign to secure key infrastructure throughout the contested regions. Rather than attempting to hold territory, the Star Phantoms focused on destroying secessionist logistics networks and command nodes. They would appear without warning, strike with overwhelming force, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements could respond, leaving behind ruined facilities and demoralized defenders. This approach proved particularly effective against the Mantis warriors, whose dispersed defensive posture relied on mutual support between installations. As the Star Phantoms methodically eliminated these support nodes, the Mantis warriors found themselves increasingly isolated and unable to coordinate their operations effectively. Within 6 months of the Star Phantoms' arrival, the Mantis warriors had been forced to abandon nearly a third of their previously held territory, retreating to more defensible positions deeper within the Endymion cluster. The arrival of the Minotaur's chapter in early 909 further strengthened the Loyalist position. Unlike the Star Phantoms, whose involvement represented a standard Imperial response to rebellion, the Minotaur's deployment carried distinct political implications. As the rumored enforcers of the High Lord's will, their presence signaled that the conflict had escalated beyond a mere regional dispute to become a matter of direct concern to Terra's highest authorities. The Minotaurs arrived in a display of overwhelming force, their fleet comprising the massive battle barge Didilos Crata, 4 strike cruisers, and numerous escort vessels. Chapter Master Asterion Moloch, a towering figure and artificer, crafted bronze armor adorned with bull motifs and ancient Terran script, commanded from the Didilos Crata's bridge, his face perpetually concealed behind a stylized helm that enhanced his already intimidating presence. The Minotaur's combat doctrine emphasized overwhelming shock assaults and close-quarters brutality. Their armor, predominantly bronze with red detailing, bore numerous honor markings and campaign badges, many of which referenced classified operations unknown to Imperial scholars. Their equipment reflected their privileged status, featuring numerous rare patterns of power armor and weapons of exceptional quality. Most notable was their extensive arsenal of Terminator armor suits, including several examples of the rare Tartaros pattern rarely seen outside the chambers of the Adeptus Custodes. Unlike the Star Phantoms, who operated with clinical detachment, the Minotaurs approached warfare with barely contained savagery. Their first major engagement came at the orbital shipyards of Vaenaya, where secessionist forces had established a repair facility for damaged vessels. The Minotaurs' assault began with a massive void strike that overwhelmed the shipyard's defenses through sheer firepower, their vessels closing to point-blank range to maximize the effectiveness of their broadside batteries. Once the outer defenses had been neutralized, the Minotaurs deployed boarding parties via assault rams and teleportarium arrays. The fighting within the shipyard's confines was brutal and uncompromising. The Minotaurs eschewed the careful room-clearing techniques favored by other chapters, instead employing breaching charges to create direct paths to their objectives regardless of structural damage. Their Terminator squads advanced in tight phalanx formations, their storm bolters and power fists methodically eliminating any resistance. The Lamentor's forces defending the shipyard fought with their characteristic determination, but found themselves outmatched by the Minotaur's ferocity and superior numbers. Within hours, the shipyard had been secured, with the surviving Lamentors forced to withdraw to their vessels. The Minotaurs showed little interest in pursuit, instead focusing on the systematic destruction of the shipyard's facilities. By the operation's conclusion, the entire complex had been rendered unusable, eliminating a crucial secessionist asset. The Minotaur's role in the conflict extended beyond mere combat operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Asterion Moloch maintained direct astropathic communication with Terra, bypassing the standard command structure established by Inquisitor Lord Frayne. This arrangement created tension within the Loyalist coalition, with some commanders expressing concern about the Minotaur's apparent autonomy and questionable battlefield practices. These concerns were not without foundation. Unlike other Loyalist chapters, who generally adhered to the principles of honorable warfare when facing fellow Astartes, the Minotaurs displayed no such restraint. Their operations against secessionist forces were characterized by a level of brutality typically reserved for xenos or chaos adversaries. Captured secessionist Astartes were not accorded the respect traditionally shown to fellow Space Marines, instead being subjected to field interrogation methods that frequently resulted in the prisoner's death. Most controversial was the Minotaur's apparent policy regarding gene seed recovery. Multiple reports indicated that Minotaur's apothecaries systematically harvested progenitor glands from fallen opponents, including fellow Loyalist Astartes killed in friendly fire incidents. When questioned about this practice, Asterion Moloch reportedly stated that all gene seed belongs to the Emperor, a technically correct but deeply unsettling justification that did little to allay suspicions about the chapter's true agenda. Despite these controversies, the Minotaur's combat effectiveness was undeniable. Their presence allowed the Loyalist coalition to launch increasingly ambitious operations against secessionist strongholds, secure in the knowledge that the Minotaurs could be deployed as a decisive reserve force when needed. This strategic flexibility proved particularly valuable as the conflict expanded to include previously uninvolved systems drawn into the war by economic necessity or political pressure. The most unexpected development in the war's middle phase came with the emergence of the Carcharodons, a chapter whose very existence had been considered apocryphal by many Imperial scholars. In late 909, as a Mantis warrior's convoy transported critical supplies through the Tranquility System, augur arrays detected unidentified vessels approaching from the galactic rim, a direction from which no Imperial forces were expected. The vessels bore no recognition codes and responded to hails with silence. Their hulls, visible only as silhouettes against the system's outer markers, displayed unfamiliar configurations that combined ancient Imperial design elements with modifications of unknown origin. As they closed with the convoy, observers noted their gray, unmarked armor plating scarred by countless impacts and void exposure, giving them a ghostly, spectral appearance. The attack, when it came, was executed with terrifying efficiency. The unidentified vessels closed to optimal weapons range before powering up their systems, minimizing the warning time available to the Mantis warriors' escorts. Their first salvos targeted propulsion systems and communications arrays with surgical precision, immobilizing the convoy and preventing distress calls. Boarding torpedoes followed immediately, delivering armored figures whose tactics spoke of extensive void warfare experience. These boarders wore armor of uniform gray, devoid of insignia save for primitive shark iconography etched into shoulder pads and helmets. They advanced in perfect silence, communicating through short-range vox clicks rather than standard Astartes battle cant. Their weapons, primarily chain weapons and bolt guns of archaic design, were maintained to peak efficiency despite their apparent age. Most disturbing were their helmets, which incorporated modified respiratory systems that produced a distinctive rasping sound as they breathed the ship's atmosphere. The Mantis warriors fought desperately to repel the boarders, but found themselves outmatched in the close confines of their vessels. The attackers displayed an intimate knowledge of ship layouts and vulnerable systems, moving with purpose directly toward command decks and engine compartments. Their combat style emphasized overwhelming close-quarters violence, with chain weapons employed to devastating psychological effect against opponents more accustomed to the clinical precision of power weapons. Within hours, the entire convoy had been captured or destroyed. The mysterious attackers harvested equipment, ammunition, and supplies from the vessels before scuttling them with precise charges that caused minimal debris dispersion. Most significantly, they recovered the progenitor glands from fallen Mantis warriors with ritualistic precision, storing these genetic materials in ornate containers inscribed with symbols that predated standard Imperial iconography. Only when the operation was complete did the attackers identify themselves through a brief, directional Vox transmission to a nearby Imperial monitoring station. They were the Carcharodons Astra, the Space Sharks, a fleet-based chapter that claimed descent from Terran stock deployed during the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Their message was simple. They had returned from the void to answer Terra's call, bringing with them judgment for those who had broken their oaths. The Carcharodons' combat doctrine differed markedly from other Loyalist chapters, where the Star Phantoms employed precision and the Minotaurs relied on overwhelming force. The Carcharodons practiced what Imperial tacticians would later term calculated savagery. Their operations began with careful observation and planning, followed by strikes of such extreme violence that they shattered not just their opponent's physical resistance, but their psychological will to fight. This approach proved devastatingly effective against the Mantis warriors, whose own doctrine relied on maintaining initiative through ambush and mobility. The Carcharodons systematically targeted the Mantis warriors' forward bases and patrol routes, employing their superior void craft to isolate and destroy elements before reinforcements could respond. Within months of their arrival, the Mantis warriors had been forced to abandon their outer defense perimeter entirely, retreating to core systems where they could concentrate their remaining forces. The strategic turning point of the conflict came at the Battle of Sagan, where secessionist naval power was decisively broken. Intelligence indicated that Huron had concentrated significant fleet assets at the Sagan system, including the Astral Claws battle barge Ekruja and elements from all three allied chapters. This concentration presented both a threat and an opportunity for Loyalist forces, the chance to engage and potentially destroy a significant portion of the secessionist fleet in a single engagement. Chapter Master Lazarek, recognizing the strategic importance of the opportunity, assembled the largest Loyalist fleet yet deployed in the conflict. The Firehawks contributed their remaining battle barges and strike cruisers, supported by vessels from the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant, and Star Phantoms. Most significantly, the Minotaurs committed their entire chapter fleet to the operation, with Asterian Moloch insisting on taking personal command of the assault force. The Loyalist plan called for a multi-vector approach that would prevent the secessionist fleet from retreating once engaged. The Star Phantoms and Marines Errant would secure the system's manville points, cutting off escape routes, while the main battle group led by the Firehawks and Minotaurs engaged the secessionist vessels directly. The Red Scorpions would target supporting infrastructure, preventing the secessionists from receiving reinforcement or resupply during the battle. The Carcharoddans, operating independently as they had throughout their involvement, requested permission to approach from the system's ecliptic plane, an unconventional vector that would require precise navigation through Sagan's dense asteroid belt. This approach would position them to strike the secessionist fleet's presumed retreat path once the main engagement began. Lazarek, recognizing the Carcharoddans' void warfare expertise, approved this high-risk maneuver. The battle began with the Loyalist main force translating from the warp at the system's edge, their arrival immediately detected by secessionist auger arrays. The secessionist fleet, comprising the Ekruja, 3 Astral Claws strike cruisers, 2 Lamenter's cruisers, and multiple escort vessels, adopted a defensive formation around the Sagan orbital docks, a position that maximized their overlapping fields of fire while allowing them to draw support from the station's defense batteries. The Loyalist vessels advanced in attack formation, with Fire Hawks and Minotaurs capital ships forming the vanguard, while smaller vessels maintained a second line to exploit breakthroughs. The secessionist fleet responded with disciplined fire patterns, focusing on the lead vessels in an attempt to break the Loyalist formation before it could close to optimal engagement range. As the battle lines closed, the Star Phantoms and Marines Errant successfully secured the system's manville points, eliminating the small picket forces stationed there and establishing blocking positions that would prevent reinforcement or escape. The Red Scorpions, meanwhile, launched precision strikes against Sagan's orbital infrastructure, targeting communication arrays and defense platforms with surgical accuracy. The turning point came 3 hours into the engagement, as the main battle reached its most intense phase. The Carcharoddans' fleet, having navigated the treacherous asteroid field, emerged directly behind the secessionist formation. Their vessels, running with minimal power signatures until the last moment, were detected only minutes before they opened fire. This perfectly timed attack caught the secessionist fleet in a devastating crossfire, with no viable retreat option. The Ekruja, recognizing the dire tactical situation, attempted a breakthrough toward the system's outer reaches, sacrificing several escort vessels to screen its movement. The maneuver might have succeeded against conventional opponents, but the Carcharoddans had anticipated this response. Their flagship, the Ancient Nicker, intercepted the Ekruja's path with uncanny precision, its forward lance batteries striking the battle barge's propulsion systems in a series of coordinated salvos that left the vessel wallowing in space, its maneuverability severely compromised. With their flagship crippled and their formation broken, the remaining secessionist vessels attempted individual escapes, abandoning any pretense of coordinated defense. Few succeeded. The Loyalist forces, now holding the tactical advantage, systematically isolated and neutralized the scattered enemy vessels. By the battle's conclusion, the secessionists had lost 1 battle barge, 4 strike cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels, representing nearly 40% of their total naval strength. The Battle of Sagan marked the beginning of the end for Huron's rebellion. With their naval power broken, the the secessionists lost the ability to coordinate operations between their dispersed territories or respond effectively to loyalist offensives. The Astral Claws and their allies were forced to adopt an increasingly defensive posture, abandoning outlying systems to concentrate their remaining forces around core worlds like Badab Primaris and the Endymion Cluster. For the Loyalist chapters, the victory at Sagan validated their diverse but complementary approaches to warfare. The Star Phantom's methodical precision, the Minotaur's overwhelming force, and the Carcharodon's calculated savagery had combined to create a military alliance of extraordinary effectiveness. As the conflict entered its final phase, these chapters would continue to spearhead the Loyalist advance, systematically dismantling Huron's rebellion piece by piece until only his fortress world remained. The Tranquility Campaign reached its brutal climax when Loyalist forces converged on the Endymion Cluster, determined to sever the Mantis warriors from the wider conflict. Chapter Master Khoisan Neodora had transformed the death world of Tranquility and its surrounding moons into a formidable defensive network, with the fortress monastery Oothika serving as the command hub for all Mantis warriors' operations in the region. The Star Phantoms, designated as the primary strike force for the operation, deployed 12 strike cruisers in a coordinated approach to the system, their bone-white hulls moving in perfect formation as they translated from the warp at precisely calculated coordinates. Chapter Master Zhrukal Androcles commanded from the battle barge Memento Mori, which remained at the system's edge to coordinate the complex, multi-phase assault he had meticulously planned over the preceding months. Tranquility itself presented a nightmare battlefield for conventional assault tactics. The Death World's surface was dominated by dense, carnivorous jungles where flora and fauna had evolved into perfect killing mechanisms. Massive pitcher plants large enough to digest space marines grew alongside venomous creeper vines that could penetrate ceramite armor through the smallest seams. The atmosphere itself contained spore colonies that could infest respiratory systems unless filtered through specialized equipment. The Mantis warriors had spent centuries adapting to these hostile conditions, incorporating the planet's natural defenses into their battle doctrine. Their scouts moved effortlessly through the jungle canopy, their armor modified with adaptive camouflage that rendered them nearly invisible against the verdant backdrop. Sniper nests positioned in the upper branches of 100-meter-tall ironbark trees provided overlapping fields of fire across the few clearings where drop pods might land. Rather than attempting a direct assault on such unfavorable terrain, Androcles implemented what Imperial strategists would later term the Starvation Protocol. The Star Phantoms established a perfect void cordon around the Tranquility system, cutting off all supply routes and communications with surgical precision. Specialized auger arrays deployed on stealth platforms monitored all electromagnetic and gravitational fluctuations, ensuring no vessel could approach or leave without detection. While the blockade tightened around Tranquility, the Star Phantoms simultaneously launched precision strikes against the 17 outlying fortress monasteries the Mantis warriors had established throughout the Endymion Cluster. Each of these facilities had been constructed to be self-sufficient, but none could withstand a dedicated siege without eventual resupply from the chapter's main force. The isolated garrison on Sigard III fell first. The Star Phantom's Third Company, led by Captain Ahmed Tiresias, deployed via night drop directly onto the fortress monastery's upper battlements. The Mantis warriors' defenders, numbering only 30 battle brothers supported by chapter serfs and servitors, fought with desperate valor, but found themselves systematically outmaneuvered by the Star Phantom's coordinated assault pattern. Tiresias employed specialized breacher squads equipped with melta charges and graviton hammers to create entry points through the fortress's armored walls, while Devastator squads established overlapping fields of fire that prevented the defenders from concentrating their forces at any single point. After 6 hours of methodical advance, the Star Phantom secured the fortress monastery with minimal casualties. The surviving Mantis warriors were given a choice that would be repeated at each conquered outpost: surrender their arms and withdraw to Tranquility under oath not to rejoin the conflict, or face execution as traitors. Most chose the former, recognizing the honorable terms being offered despite the grim circumstances. Similar operations unfolded across the Endymion cluster over the following months. The fortress on Bellerophon's Folly fell to the 5th Company after a 3-day siege. The subterranean complex on Shadowed Star surrendered after Star Phantom's tech marines disabled its life support systems. One by one, the outer bastions of Mantis Warriors' resistance were methodically eliminated, their garrisons either withdrawn to tranquility or neutralized. By the year 913 of the 41st millennium, the Mantis Warriors found themselves compressed into an increasingly constricted defensive perimeter centered on Tranquility and its 2 primary moons. Chapter Master Neodora, recognizing the inevitable conclusion of this strategy, prepared for a last stand that would extract the maximum cost from his opponents. The remaining Mantis Warriors' assets, approximately 400 battle brothers supported by whatever equipment and vehicles they had managed to preserve, were distributed between 3 key strongpoints: the Fortress Monastery Oothika on Tranquility's largest moon, the surface redoubt known as the Venom Pit on Tranquility itself, and the Void Station Tranquility Sentinel in high orbit. As the noose tightened around the Mantis Warriors, events elsewhere in the conflict zone would dramatically alter the strategic calculus. The Executioners chapter, which had maintained an increasingly uncomfortable alliance with Huron's forces, found itself confronting evidence that could no longer be ignored. Chapter Master Arkash Hakin, whose participation in the rebellion had always been predicated on the blood debt owed to Huron, rather than ideological alignment, received disturbing reports from his forces stationed near Badab Primaris. Executioners Chaplain Thulsa Kane, leading a detachment assigned to security operations around the Tyrant's palace, had witnessed concerning rituals being performed by Astral Claws apothecaries in the depths of the fortress. Kane, renowned for his unflinching adherence to Imperial doctrine despite his chapter's fierce independence, documented evidence of gene seed experimentation that incorporated techniques bearing the unmistakable taint of forbidden knowledge. Most disturbing were the physical modifications observed in Huron's elite guard, whose augmentations went far beyond standard Astartes enhancements and incorporated components of clearly xenos origin. Kane compiled his findings and transmitted them directly to Hakin via a secure channel established specifically for this purpose. The evidence presented the Executioner's chapter master with a crisis of honor. The blood debt that bound his chapter to Huron's cause was sacred under their ancient traditions, but equally sacred was their oath to the Emperor and the purity of the Astartes gene seed. If Huron had indeed corrupted the Astral Claws with forbidden technology and possibly warp influence, the terms of the blood debt would be fundamentally violated. After 3 days of meditation in his private sanctum, surrounded by the skulls of worthy opponents collected throughout his centuries of service, Hakin reached his decision. The Executioners would withdraw from the conflict immediately, neither supporting Huron's increasingly corrupt regime nor turning their weapons against him. This careful distinction allowed them to preserve their honor while extracting themselves from an untenable position. Hakin summoned his senior officers to the chapter's flagship, the battle barge Knight's Reaper, currently stationed in the outer reaches of the Badab system. There, surrounded by the ancient weapons and battle standards that chronicled the Executioner's long history, he announced his decision. The chapter would consolidate its forces and prepare to face the consequences of their actions, but they would shed no more blood for Huron's ambitions. The withdrawal was executed with characteristic Executioner's efficiency. Strike forces deployed throughout Huron's territory disengaged from their assignments and made rendezvous with designated extraction vessels. Within 72 hours, nearly 800 Executioner's battle brothers had been recovered and concentrated in the Knight's Reaper's battle group, which then proceeded toward the Maelstrom's edge, where they established a defensive perimeter and opened communications with Loyalist forces. Inquisitor Lord Frayne, recognizing the strategic opportunity presented by the Executioner's change of position, personally traveled to meet with Hakin aboard the inquisitorial cruiser Righteous Judgment. The meeting between these two formidable individuals, the implacable Inquisitor and the honor-bound chapter master, lasted 17 hours, with only their respective honor guards as witnesses. The terms negotiated during this historic meeting would shape the executioner's fate for centuries to come. Hakon agreed to a 100-year penitent crusade, during which the executioners would receive no support from the Imperium and would seek redemption through constant warfare against the Emperor's enemies in the Galactic Rim. In return, the chapter would retain its autonomy and avoid the more severe censures that might otherwise have been imposed. Most importantly to Hakon, the chapter's geneseed would not be declared corrupted, allowing the executioners to eventually rebuild their strength. As a final condition of the agreement, Hakon provided detailed intelligence about Huron's remaining defenses and the disposition of Astral Claws forces throughout the Badab sector. This information, while not directly contributing to combat operations against his former allies, nevertheless represented a significant strategic advantage for the Loyalist forces planning the final phase of the campaign. The executioners' withdrawal dealt a severe psychological blow to the remaining secessionist forces. The Astral Claws had lost a powerful ally, while the Mantis warriors and Lamenters found themselves increasingly isolated. More damaging was the implicit judgment represented by Hakon's decision. If the honorable executioners had determined that Huron's cause was no longer worthy of their support, what did that suggest about the nature of the rebellion? With the executioners neutralized as a factor in the conflict, Loyalist forces could concentrate their attention on the remaining secessionist strongholds. The Mantis warriors, already compressed into their final defensive perimeter around Tranquility, now faced the full might of the Star Phantoms with no hope of external relief. The assault on Tranquility began with a series of precision strikes against the orbital station Tranquility Sentinel. Star Phantoms boarding parties, transported in specially modified Cestus assault rams, breached the station's outer defenses and established footholds at key junctures. The fighting within the confined corridors of the Void Station was brutal and unforgiving. Mantis Warriors' defenders had prepared elaborate kill zones with pre-sighted heavy weapons and sequential fallback positions, extracting a heavy toll from the attackers for every meter gained. Captain Raphael Lycidius, commanding the Star Phantoms boarding force, employed specialized breacher squads to bypass the main defensive positions, targeting life support systems and power distribution nodes rather than attempting to overcome the defenders directly. This approach gradually rendered sections of the station uninhabitable, forcing the Mantis warriors to consolidate their defense around critical systems that could not be abandoned. After 36 hours of continuous fighting, the Tranquility Sentinel fell to Loyalist forces. Of the 78 Mantis warriors assigned to the station's defense, only 19 survived to be taken prisoner. The Star Phantoms suffered 43 casualties, including the venerable dreadnought Iophan, whose sarcophagus was breached by a concentrated melta-blast during the final assault on the station's command center. With orbital superiority established, the Star Phantoms turned their attention to the moon-based fortress monastery Oothika. Unlike the Void Station, which had been designed primarily for monitoring and communication purposes, Oothika represented a purpose-built Astartes fortress with defenses designed to withstand sustained siege. Its outer walls, constructed from adamantium-reinforced ferrocrete 20 meters thick, bristled with defense batteries ranging from quad-linked heavy bolters to Icarus-pattern lascannons capable of engaging targets in low orbit. Chapter Master Androcles, recognizing the prohibitive cost of a direct assault, implemented a more measured approach. Star Phantom strike cruisers established a tight orbital pattern around the moon, their bombardment cannons systematically targeting the fortress monastery's outer defenses with calculated precision. Rather than attempting to breach the main structure, these strikes focused on degrading the defensive capabilities that might threaten subsequent landing operations. Simultaneously, Star Phantom's Techmarines deployed specialized auger baffling devices at key points around the fortress, creating electromagnetic dead zones that prevented the defenders from accurately tracking Loyalist movements. Under this cover, scout squads infiltrated the perimeter, placing homing beacons for the main assault force while neutralizing outlying sensor arrays and communication relays. The ground assault, when it finally came, struck from multiple vectors simultaneously. Drop pods delivered tactical squads directly onto the fortress's upper levels, while Thunderhawk gunships deployed Terminator squads at key entry points identified by the earlier reconnaissance. The Mantis warriors, anticipating this approach, had prepared layered defenses with pre-sighted heavy weapons covering likely landing zones and mobile reserve forces ready to counter-attack any breakthrough. The resulting battle devolved into dozens of separate engagements throughout the fortress monastery's vast complex. The Star Phantoms advanced methodically, securing each section before proceeding deeper, while the Mantis warriors executed a fighting withdrawal that extracted maximum casualties at every defensive position. The fortress's design, with its redundant systems and multiple internal barriers, perfectly suited this defensive strategy, allowing even the outnumbered defenders to maintain an effective resistance for days. On the fourth day of the assault, with fighting still raging throughout Oathika's lower levels, Chapter Master Neotera made an unexpected decision. Rather than continuing a resistance that could only end in complete destruction, he opened a direct Vox channel to Androcles and requested terms for surrender. The Mantis warriors would lay down their arms if their wounded could receive proper medical attention, and their geneseed would be preserved rather than destroyed. Androcles, who had developed a grudging respect for his opponent's tenacity, agreed to these terms with one significant addition. The Mantis warriors would submit to whatever judgment the Emperor's representatives deemed appropriate for their role in the rebellion. Neotera, recognizing that his chapter had no viable alternative, accepted this condition. The final siege of Tranquility II concluded with the formal surrender of the Mantis warriors in the Great Hall of Oathika. Chapter Master Neotera, accompanied by his surviving company captains, presented his forced sword to Androcles in the ancient tradition of defeated commanders. The Star Phantom's chapter master accepted the weapon, but immediately returned it, a gesture of respect acknowledging that the Mantis warriors had fought with honor despite their misguided allegiance. In the aftermath of the surrender, Inquisitor Lord Frayne arrived to formalize the terms of the Mantis warriors' censure. Like the executioners before them, the chapter would undertake a penitent crusade, though with the additional stipulation that they would be barred from recruiting new members for the duration of their sentence. This restriction, combined with their combat losses during the conflict, reduced the once proud chapter to barely 200 battle brothers, a precarious position that would require careful management to avoid extinction. With the Mantis warriors and executioners removed from the conflict, the Loyalist forces could now concentrate their full attention on the remaining secessionist strongholds. The Lamenters, already heavily depleted by earlier engagements, found themselves increasingly isolated as Loyalist forces tightened their cordon around Huron's remaining territory. The final phase of the Badab War was approaching, with the tyrant himself soon to face the consequences of his ambition. The final assault on Badab Primaris began with meticulous planning that would become a textbook example of Astartes' combined operations for centuries to come. Lord High Commander Kareb Kuln of the Red Scorpions, having been granted overall tactical command of the ground campaign by Inquisitor Lord Frayne, assembled his senior officers aboard the battle barge Sword of Orden in the early days of 913. The austere strategic chamber, dominated by a massive hololithic table displaying Badab Primaris in exacting detail, became the nexus of what would be the most complex Astartes operation since the Siege of Vrax. Representatives from each Loyalist chapter brought their specialized expertise to the planning sessions. The Firehawks contributed detailed knowledge of siege warfare gleaned from their extensive campaigns against fortified positions. The Star Phantoms offered precision strike doctrines that had proved devastatingly effective against the Mantis warriors. The Karkaroddans, though maintaining their characteristic reserve, provided invaluable intelligence on void defense patterns gathered during their silent observation of Badab's orbital approaches. The strategic challenge was formidable. Badab Primaris had been transformed over decades into what Imperial strategists classified as a Praetorian-grade fortress world. 3 massive orbital battle stations, Emperor's Judgment, Vengeful Hand, and Absolute, formed the outer defensive layer, each station bristling with lance batteries and torpedo silos capable of engaging targets at extreme range. Between these anchor points floated hundreds of automated defense platforms ranging from basic weapons satellites to sophisticated auger arrays linked to predictive targeting cogitators. The planet's surface presented equally daunting obstacles. The Palace Crimson, Huron's renamed fortress monastery, dominated the northern hemisphere, its blood-red towers visible from orbit. What had once been a standard Astartes fortress had been expanded into a sprawling complex covering nearly 200 square kilometers. Multiple concentric rings of ferrocrete bastions, void shield generators, and defense batteries surrounded the central keep, where intelligence suggested Huron had established his command center. Cullen's plan leveraged the specific strengths of each participating chapter. The Red Scorpions and Fire Hawks would form the main assault force, targeting the primary defensive positions with overwhelming firepower. The Star Phantoms would conduct precision strikes against key infrastructure, power generation facilities, communications arrays, and void shield projectors. The Minotaurs, under Asterian Moloch's direct command, would serve as the exploitation force, ready to capitalize on any breakthrough with devastating shock assaults. The Carcharoddans requested, and were granted, a specialized role that suited their particular combat doctrine. They would deploy independently, infiltrating through the peripheral defense networks to strike directly at secondary command nodes. This approach would sow confusion among the defenders, while disrupting their ability to coordinate responses to the main assault. The void battle for Badab Primaris began when the combined Loyalist fleet translated from the warp at carefully calculated coordinates beyond the range of the orbital defense grid. The Armada represented one of the largest concentrations of Astartes naval power seen in centuries. 6 battle barges, 28 strike cruisers, and dozens of escort vessels arranged in precise formation. Accompanying this force were elements of Battle Fleet Scarus, including the Mars-class battlecruiser Dominus Astra and 4 Gothic-class cruisers. The Astral Claws responded immediately, their remaining fleet assets moving to engage the approaching Loyalist vessels. The battle barge Crucia, bearing the scars of previous engagements but still a formidable capital ship, formed the center of their defensive line. Supporting it were 4 strike cruisers and numerous system defense boats, a substantial force, but clearly outmatched by the Loyalist Armada. What followed was a masterclass in void warfare tactics. Rather than engaging directly, the Loyalist vessels executed a complex series of maneuvers designed to draw portions of the defensive fleet out of position. The Red Scorpion strike cruisers Verity and Vigilance advanced ahead of the main formation, appearing to offer themselves as vulnerable targets. When 2 Astral Claws cruisers moved to intercept, they found themselves caught in a carefully prepared crossfire as Fire Hawk's vessels emerged from behind Badab's smaller moon, their weapons already locked on target. Similar tactical gambits unfolded across the battlefield as the Loyalists systematically dismantled the outer defense perimeter. The Carcharoddans demonstrated their void warfare expertise by executing a daring attack run directly through the orbital defense grid, their vessels moving with uncanny precision to exploit gaps in the coverage that conventional auger analysis had failed to identify. This maneuver placed them in optimal position to assault the orbital station Emperor's Judgment, the weakest of the 3 primary defense platforms. The boarding action that followed exemplified the Carcharoddans' approach to warfare. Their assault craft breached the station's outer hull at multiple points simultaneously, delivering kill teams directly to critical systems. The defenders, primarily human crew supported by Astral Claws veterans, found themselves facing an enemy that moved through the station's corridors like predators in their natural environment. The Carcharoddans advanced in near silence, communicating through short-range vox clicks rather than standard battle cant, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision. Within 6 hours, Emperor's Judgment had fallen, its guns silenced and its command deck secured. Rather than garrisoning the captured station, the Carcharoddans systematically destroyed its critical systems before withdrawing to their vessels, leaving behind a dead hulk that would play no further role in the battle. This approach, neutralizing rather than capturing objectives, typified their contribution to the campaign, allowing them to maintain momentum while minimizing their commitment to any single target. As the Void battle progressed, the Astral Claws fleet found itself gradually compressed into an increasingly tight defensive perimeter around Badab Primaris. The battle barge Acrusia, recognizing the inevitability of defeat if it remained engaged, executed a daring breakthrough maneuver that carried it past the Loyalist blockade and into the relative safety of the outer system. This tactical withdrawal, while preserving the vessel and its irreplaceable crew, left the remaining Astral Claws vessels without their primary command ship. With Void superiority established, the Loyalist forces began systematic bombardment of ground targets. Strike cruisers entered low orbit in carefully timed rotations, their bombardment cannons targeting defensive emplacements with surgical precision. The objective was not to destroy the Palace Crimson, which would have required firepower sufficient to render the entire region uninhabitable, but to degrade its outer defenses sufficiently to permit ground assault. The Astral Claws responded with their remaining orbital defense batteries, including several massive macro cannons concealed within the volcanic mountains surrounding the fortress. These weapons, powerful enough to threaten even shielded capital ships, forced the Loyalist vessels to maintain higher orbits than optimal for precision bombardment. This defensive advantage was gradually neutralized as Star Phantom strike teams deployed via drop pod directly onto the identified weapon positions, disabling them one by one in a series of daring raids. After 7 days of orbital operations, Culm determined that conditions were suitable for the main assault to begin. The ground war commenced with a massive drop pod deployment that delivered nearly 800 Astartes to the surface simultaneously. The Red Scorpions formed the center of the assault, targeting the main approach to the Palace Crimson with a concentration of force designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer firepower. The Fire Hawks deployed on their flank, securing the western approaches, while the Star Phantoms targeted critical infrastructure in the eastern quadrant. The defenders responded with disciplined counterfire that extracted a heavy toll from the attackers. Concealed heavy weapon emplacements, many of them operated by Tyrant's Legion troops rather than Astral Claws themselves, laid down overlapping fields of fire that turned the approaches to the fortress into killing grounds. Pre-sighted artillery positions bombarded the Loyalist landing zones, forcing tactical squads to advance under constant fire. Despite these challenges, the Loyalist forces established a secure perimeter around their landing zones within the first 24 hours of the assault. Thunderhawk gunships delivered Predator tanks and Land Raiders to support the advance, their armored hulls providing much-needed protection as the Space Marines pushed toward the fortress's outer defenses. Techmarine-operated servo haulers brought forward prefabricated bunker sections that were rapidly assembled into forward command posts, creating a network of hardened positions from which subsequent operations could be coordinated. The Astral Claws defense demonstrated both tactical acumen and desperate resolve. Rather than attempting to hold the entire perimeter against superior numbers, they conducted a series of controlled withdrawals that channeled the attackers into predetermined kill zones. Buildings that appeared abandoned were revealed as carefully prepared ambush positions once Loyalist forces moved past them. Underground passages allowed defender reinforcements to appear unexpectedly behind advancing units, disrupting their momentum and forcing them to secure areas they had believed cleared. The most formidable obstacle proved to be the network of void shields protecting the Palace Crimson itself. Unlike standard Imperial designs that projected a single cohesive field, the palace's defenses incorporated multiple overlapping generators that created a layered barrier. When one section was breached, adjacent projectors would extend their coverage to compensate, making it nearly impossible to create a permanent entry point through conventional means. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Karkarodon's tech marines, analyzing data gathered during their earlier operations, identified a synchronization pattern in the Void Shield network that created momentary vulnerabilities during power cycling sequences. These gaps lasted mere seconds and occurred at irregular intervals, but with proper timing, they could potentially allow a small force to penetrate the defenses. Captain Baal Shar of the Karkarodons requested permission to exploit this vulnerability with a targeted insertion of his Terminator elite, the Pale Nomads. Kuln, recognizing the strategic opportunity despite the extreme risk, approved the operation. The assault force would deploy via teleportarium directly into the main generator complex, disabling it from within while the main loyalist force launched a diversionary attack against the fortress's main gate. The operation commenced on the 11th day of the ground campaign. As Fire Hawks and Red Scorpions, forces mounted a massive frontal assault against the palace's outer walls, drawing defender resources to the perimeter. The Karkarodin strike team teleported directly into the heart of the fortress. The insertion proved only partially successful. Of the 15 Terminators in the assault team, only 9 materialized intact, the others lost to the vagaries of teleportation through active void shields. These 9 warriors, led by First Hunt Master Tyne, fought their way through the generator complex with grim determination. Moving in perfect coordination despite being cut off from external communication by the surrounding void fields, they systematically disabled the primary power distribution nodes that fed the shield network. Each destroyed node created cascading failures in the system, gradually degrading the fortress's protective envelope. On the perimeter, the diversionary assault had become a genuine breakthrough opportunity as sections of the void shield began failing. Red Scorpion Centurion assault squads, their massive armor shrugging off all but the heaviest defensive fire, breached the outer wall in 3 locations simultaneously. Behind them came tactical squads in precise codex formation, securing each section of the breach before advancing deeper into the fortress complex. The inner defenses of the Palace Crimson revealed Huron's extensive preparations for this eventuality. Entire sections of corridor had been rigged with demolition charges that collapsed on advancing loyalist forces. Automated defense turrets emerged from concealed emplacements, their targeting systems linked to motion detectors that distinguished friend from foe through encrypted Vox transponders. Most disturbing were the modified combat servitors deployed in choke points, former humans enhanced with prohibited cybernetic systems that displayed capabilities far beyond standard Imperial patterns. The Star Phantoms, advancing through the eastern quadrant of the fortress, encountered the most determined resistance. Intelligence had identified this area as housing the Astral Claws apothecarian facilities, where Huron's chief apothecary Garion had conducted his forbidden experiments. The defenders here included not just standard Astral Claws tactical marines, but specially modified warriors, whose armor incorporated unfamiliar components of apparent xenos origin. These troops fought with unusual coordination and displayed physical capabilities that exceeded normal Astartes parameters, confirming the worst suspicions about Huron's genetic experimentation. As the battle for the Palace Crimson entered its 3rd day, Loyalist forces had secured approximately 40% of the outer complex, but found themselves stalled by increasingly fanatical resistance as they approached the central keep. Astral Claws veterans, many bearing the red gauntlets that marked them as members of Huron's personal guard, counter-attacked with suicidal determination, reclaiming sections of the fortress that had been thought secured. The turning point came when Minotaur's forces, held in reserve until this moment, were committed to the battle. Chapter Master Asterion Moloch led the assault personally, his ancient artificer armor gleaming like freshly spilled blood as he strode through the breach in the inner curtain wall. Behind him came the Minotaur's Terminator elite, their massive forms advancing implacably through defensive fire that would have annihilated lesser troops. The Minotaur's advance targeted the palace's central communication hub, a massive tower that coordinated the remaining defensive systems. Their approach was direct and uncompromising, eschewing the careful room-clearing techniques employed by other chapters in favor of raw destructive power. Breacher squads equipped with melta charges created new pathways through armored bulkheads, bypassing prepared defensive positions and driving directly toward their objective with unstoppable momentum. As the Minotaurs neared the central keep, augur readings detected a massive energy buildup in the lower levels of the fortress. Techmarine analysis identified the signature as consistent with plasma reactor emergency protocols, specifically containment field deactivation sequences. The implications were clear and horrifying. Huron had initiated self-destruct procedures that would detonate the fortress's primary power source, creating an explosion powerful enough to annihilate everything within several kilometers. Loyalist forces immediately began withdrawal from the danger zone, abandoning hard-won positions in a desperate race against time. Thunderhawk gunships, operating at maximum capacity and dangerously exposed to remaining defensive fire, extracted hundreds of Space Marines from landing zones hastily established on the fortress's outer sections. Those too deep within the complex to reach extraction points sought whatever shelter they could find, using fallen masonry and armored bulkheads to create improvised bunkers against the coming detonation. The explosion, when it came, exceeded even the worst projections. The plasma reactor's detonation triggered secondary explosions throughout the fortress, as ammunition stores and auxiliary power systems were consumed in the spreading firestorm. The central keep simply vanished, replaced by a crater nearly a kilometer across and hundreds of meters deep. The blast wave flattened structures for kilometers in every direction, throwing armored vehicles through the air like toys and burying entire squads under mountains of debris. When the dust settled, nearly 30% of the committed Loyalist forces were dead or missing, with many more wounded too severely to continue fighting. The Palace Crimson had been transformed from a formidable fortress into a shattered ruin, its once proud towers reduced to radioactive rubble that would remain deadly to unprotected humans for centuries. Most concerning to the Loyalist commanders was the absence of any confirmed remains of Huron himself. Although the central keep had been completely destroyed, suggesting that anyone inside would have been vaporized instantly, no genetic trace of the Tyrant of Badab was found in subsequent sweeps of the area. Equally troubling was the disappearance of the battle barge Crucia, which augur stations tracked, making a high-energy translation into the warp on the exact moment of the fortress's destruction, its destination unknown. The remaining Astral Claws resistance collapsed quickly after the destruction of their fortress monastery. Isolated pockets continued fighting for several days, but without central coordination, they were systematically eliminated by Loyalist sweep operations. The human elements of the Tyrant's legion largely surrendered once it became clear that Huron had abandoned them, throwing themselves on the mercy of Imperial authorities. Badab Primaris itself presented a challenging occupation scenario. Decades of Huron's rule had transformed the planet's population into fanatically loyal subjects who viewed the Loyalist forces as invaders rather than liberators. Manufactoria workers sabotaged their equipment rather than allow it to fall into Loyalist hands. Civilian administrators destroyed records that might have provided intelligence about secessionist operations elsewhere. Even children participated in the resistance, serving as lookouts and messengers for the remaining Astral Claws cells. Inquisitor Lord Frayne, recognizing the depth of the contamination, made the difficult decision to implement Exterminatus-grade population controls. While stopping short of destroying the planet entirely, his directives called for the systematic removal of all civilians from areas surrounding the former Palace Crimson, with the population relocated to containment centers where they could be screened for corruption. Those found wanting would face summary execution. Those deemed salvageable would be mined, wiped, and redistributed to labor colonies throughout the sector. The atomic destruction of the Palace Crimson marked the effective end of organized resistance in the Badab War, though scattered engagements would continue for several more months as Loyalist forces secured outlying systems and hunted down secessionist remnants. The conflict had lasted nearly a decade, claimed thousands of Astartes' lives on both sides, and fundamentally altered the political landscape of the region for centuries to come. The final confrontation between the Loyalist forces and Hurons, elite corpse takers, unfolded in the smoldering ruins of Palace Crimson's eastern wing. Intelligence reports had identified this section as the last pocket of organized resistance, where approximately 40 Astral Claws veterans had established a defensive perimeter around what appeared to be a Medici facility buried deep beneath the shattered fortress. These warriors bore the distinctive crimson gauntlets of Huron's personal guard, their armor adorned with trophies taken from fallen Loyalists throughout the long conflict. Lord High Commander Kareb Kuln deployed elements of the Red Scorpion's First Company to breach this final stronghold. Supported by Fire Hawk's Devastator squads, positioned to prevent any attempted breakout. The assault began with a coordinated bombardment from Whirlwind artillery tanks, their missiles precisely calibrated to weaken the facility's outer defenses without causing catastrophic structural collapse. As the dust settled, Terminator squads advanced through the newly created breaches, their storm bolters methodically clearing each chamber they encountered. The corpse takers defended their position with the desperate ferocity of warriors who expected no mercy. They had transformed the Medici facility into a layered killing ground, with automated defense turrets covering choke points and pre-positioned explosives rigged to collapse key passageways behind them as they executed a fighting withdrawal toward the central chamber. Most disturbing were the modified combat servitors they deployed as expendable shock troops, former humans subjected to extensive cybernetic augmentation that went far beyond standard Imperial patterns. These creations displayed a disturbing level of tactical coordination, suggesting some form of group mind architecture prohibited by Mechanicus doctrine. As the Red Scorpions pressed deeper into the facility, they discovered evidence of activities that confirmed their worst suspicions about Huron's fall. Laboratory chambers contained gene seed cultivation equipment modified with components of clearly xenos origin. Stasis pods housed partially transformed Astartes subjects displaying physiological changes inconsistent with standard implantation protocols. Data slates recovered from workstations contained research notes detailing experiments combining space marine genetic material with unidentified biological samples retrieved from the depths of the Maelstrom. The central chamber, when finally breached on the third day of the operation, revealed a scene that would haunt even veteran Astartes for decades. At its center stood a massive surgical apparatus combining Imperial Medici technology with components that defied conventional classification. The machine hummed with barely contained energy, its surface inscribed with symbols that caused physical discomfort when viewed directly. Surrounding it were 13 Astral Claws apothecaries in modified armor, their traditional white heraldry now stained crimson with what analysis would later confirm was a mixture of human and Astartes blood. The apothecaries fought to the last man, employing not just conventional weapons, but also biological agents dispersed through modified narthecium devices. These compounds forced the Red Scorpions to seal their armor and engage external filtration systems, slowing their advance and allowing the defenders to exact a heavy toll before being overwhelmed. Of the 23 Terminators who entered the central chamber, only 11 survived the engagement. Most significant was what they didn't find. Huron himself was absent, though evidence suggested he had been present recently. A command throne, modified with extensive life support systems, stood empty at the chamber's far end. Analysis of biological residue on its surface confirmed it had recently contained a severely wounded Astartes matching Huron's genetic profile. Fluid drainage systems still contained traces of what appeared to be a specialized suspension medium designed to maintain tissue viability during extensive reconstruction procedures. Techmarine examination of the facility's data cores, those that hadn't been wiped or destroyed during the fighting, yielded fragmentary information about what had transpired in the days following the destruction of Palace Crimson's central keep. Huron had indeed been present during the plasma reactor detonation, but had been recovered from the ruins by his most loyal followers. The Tyrant had suffered catastrophic injuries, with approximately 60% of his body destroyed by the explosion and subsequent fires. By any reasonable medical standard, his wounds were unsurvivable. Yet the recovered data indicated that Huron's apothecaries had implemented what they termed Protocol Lazarus, an experimental procedure combining conventional Astartes organ transplantation with technologies of uncertain origin. The process involved the grafting of extensive bionics to replace destroyed tissue, supplemented with organic components harvested from compatible donors. Most disturbing were references to empiric stabilization, a term associated with techniques that bridge the gap between conventional technology and warp-based systems. While Loyalist forces secured the remains of Palace Crimson, events elsewhere in the sector revealed the consequences of Huron's apparent escape. Astropathic communications intercepted by inquisitorial listening posts detected coded transmissions originating from the edge of the Maelstrom, a turbulent warp storm that had long served as a haven for renegades and pirates. Analysis of these transmissions suggested they contained rally coordinates for scattered Astral Claws elements that had escaped the fall of Badab Primaris. The battle barge Crucia, which had withdrawn from the void battle above Badab days earlier, was confirmed to have translated into the warp on a course that would take it directly into the Maelstrom's outer reaches. Augur stations tracking its departure noted unusual energy signatures, suggesting modifications to its Geller field generators, changes that might allow it to navigate the Maelstrom's treacherous currents with greater safety than standard Imperial vessels. Approximately 200 Astral Claws battle brothers were unaccounted for after the fall of Badab Primaris, representing the remnants of a chapter that had once numbered over 1,500 warriors. Intelligence suggested these survivors had withdrawn in small groups using pre-positioned escape craft, many of them following carefully plotted courses that utilized the Maelstrom's gravitational influence to mask their warp signatures from Imperial tracking systems. The first confirmed sighting of what would become the Red Corsairs came 3 months after the fall of Badab. A merchant vessel traversing the shipping lanes near the Maelstrom's edge reported being attacked by Astartes vessels bearing unfamiliar heraldry, predominantly black armor with crimson trim, their hulls displaying a modified version of the Astral Claws insignia. The attackers demonstrated void warfare tactics consistent with Astral Claws doctrine, but executed with a level of brutality previously uncharacteristic of the chapter. Rather than simply seizing cargo, they systematically executed the merchant crew after extracting navigational data and communication codes. Similar incidents multiplied over the following months, establishing a pattern of operations focused on acquiring specific resources rather than random piracy. The renegades targeted vessels carrying advanced technology, medical supplies, and weapons-grade materials, while largely ignoring more conventional cargo. Most concerning were raids against Mechanicus exploration vessels and isolated research stations, suggesting a deliberate acquisition strategy focused on technological assets that might support Huron's continued transformation. Inquisitorial agents operating in port facilities along the Maelstrom's edge gathered accounts from survivors who claimed to have glimpsed the leader of these renegades. They described a massive figure encased in elaborate artificer armor, the right side of his body replaced with complex bionics that hummed with unnatural energy. Most distinctive was the power claw that had replaced his right arm, a massive weapon incorporating technology beyond standard Imperial patterns, its surface etched with symbols that caused witnesses to experience headaches and nausea when they attempted to describe them in detail. The first official confirmation of Huron's survival came from astropathic interrogation of captured Red Corsairs. Under psychic questioning that left several subjects catatonic, Inquisitor Valk of the Ordo Malleus extracted fragmentary images of what Huron had become. The once noble features of the Tyrant of Badab had been replaced by a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine. The right side of his head had been entirely reconstructed with a bionic system that extended tendrils into his remaining organic tissue. His right arm had been replaced with a massive power claw incorporating technology that appeared to draw energy directly from the warp itself. Most disturbing was the life support system integrated into his torso, a complex mechanism that pulsed with unnatural light and occasionally discharged arcs of energy that seemed to exist simultaneously in real space and the Imperium. The technological heresies that had preserved Huron's life represented a convergence of forbidden knowledge from multiple sources. Analysis of recovered Red Corsairs equipment indicated the incorporation of techniques drawn from Dark Mechanicum archives, xenotech components of probable Eldar origin, and most concerning, methodologies consistent with those employed by the traitor legions during the Horus Heresy. This combination suggested either extensive preparation predating the Badab War or the acquisition of knowledge from sources within the Maelstrom itself, possibly both. The transformation of the surviving Astral Claws into the Red Corsairs represented more than a simple change in heraldry. Interrogation of captured renegades revealed that Huron had implemented fundamental changes to the chapter's organization and doctrine. The Codex Astartes structure had been abandoned entirely, replaced with a more fluid hierarchy based on personal loyalty and combat effectiveness. Traditional company divisions dissolved in favor of warbands led by commanders who had proven their worth through successful raids and the acquisition of valuable resources. Most significant was the change in recruitment and implementation protocols. No longer bound by the careful screening processes that had governed Astartes' creation for millennia, Huron implemented accelerated procedures that prioritized quantity over quality. Compatible candidates captured during raids were subjected to rapid implantation of gene seed, often with minimal psychological conditioning. The failure rate was catastrophic. Nearly 70% of subjects died during the process, but the survivors, while frequently unstable, provided a steady influx of new warriors to replace battle losses. The Red Corsairs' base of operations remained elusive to Imperial intelligence for several years after their emergence. Scattered reports suggested they had established multiple facilities throughout the Maelstrom, using the warp storm's disruptive effects to mask their precise locations. The primary stronghold, eventually identified as a massive space station of unknown origin designated Blackheart's Redoubt, appeared to be mobile, changing position within the Maelstrom to avoid detection or targeting by Imperial forces. Huron's new title, Blackheart, derived from the power source that had replaced his destroyed heart. Captured technical data described a device that incorporated both conventional power generation and warp-based energies, creating a self-sustaining system that could theoretically function indefinitely as long as it maintained access to the Imperium. This black heart served as both life support and power source for his extensive bionics, its influence gradually extending throughout his remaining organic tissue through a network of microscopic filaments that blurred the distinction between man and machine. The psychological impact of Huron's transformation manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as his new existence stabilized. Where the Tyrant of Badab had been calculating and strategic, Blackheart displayed episodes of manic intensity, alternating with periods of cold, detached analysis. Former Astral Claws who had served under him before the transformation reported that he would sometimes lapse into one-sided conversations with entities only he could perceive, particularly during warp transit or when in proximity to artifacts recovered from the depths of the Maelstrom. Most concerning to the Inquisition was Huron's apparent ability to perceive and manipulate warp energies despite having no recorded psychic potential before his transformation. Blackheart demonstrated capabilities consistent with minor biomancy and divination disciplines, though manifested through technological interfaces rather than conventional psychic techniques. Whether these abilities derived from his bionic enhancements, exposure to the Maelstrom's influence, or some combination of factors remained unclear, but their implications for his long-term evolution were deeply troubling to those tasked with monitoring his activities. By 915, the Red Corsairs had established themselves as one of the most significant renegade forces operating in the galactic southeast. Their numbers, bolstered by both accelerated recruitment and the absorption of other renegade Astartes drawn to Huron's growing legend, had expanded to approximately 300 warriors, a fraction of the Astral Claws at their height, but a substantial force when concentrated for specific operations. Their fleet, comprising the battle barge Cruja, 5 strike cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels, represented a genuine threat to Imperial shipping throughout the region. Most significant was Huron Blackheart's emerging role as a nexus for renegade Astartes throughout the sector. Warriors who had broken from their chapters for reasons ranging from doctrinal disputes to outright heresy found their way to his banner, drawn by the promise of resources, purpose, and protection from Imperial retribution. Blackheart welcomed these additions regardless of their origins, assessing each warrior solely on their potential value to his growing empire rather than their past affiliations or ideological alignment. This pragmatic approach to recruitment created a warband of unprecedented diversity, incorporating elements from dozens of chapters with widely varying combat doctrines and cultural traditions. Rather than attempting to impose standardization, Blackheart encouraged specialization, assigning warriors to roles that leveraged their existing skills while gradually reshaping their loyalties through a combination of charismatic leadership and calculated reward systems. The smoldering ruins of Badab Primaris cast long shadows across the sector as the final embers of rebellion were systematically extinguished by Imperial forces. The fall of Palace Crimson and Huron's transformation into the renegade warlord Blackheart marked not an ending but a dark beginning, both for the region and the wider Imperium. In the aftermath of nearly a decade of brutal conflict, the cost of the Badab War became horrifyingly clear as each loyalist chapter tallied their losses, and the Inquisition began the monumental task of determining appropriate judgment for those who had turned against the Emperor's light. The war's toll on the loyalist chapters had been devastating. The Fire Hawks, who had borne the brunt of the early fighting, lost over 350 battle brothers, more than a third of their total strength. Their fleet, once among the most formidable of any non-crusading chapter, had been reduced to 2 battle barges and 7 strike cruisers, many bearing damage too extensive for field repairs. Chapter Master Stibber Lazarek, his once imposing frame now bearing extensive augmetic replacements for limbs lost during the final assault on Palace Crimson, faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding his chapter with severely depleted resources. The Red Scorpions emerged from the conflict with approximately 280 casualties, including the venerable dreadnought Venable, whose sarcophagus was breached during a Mantis warrior's ambush in the war's middle phase. Lord High Commander Karab Kuln, while physically intact, bore the psychological burden of having ordered operations that resulted in the deaths of fellow Astartes, a weight that would influence his increasingly strict interpretation of the Codex Astartes in subsequent decades. The Marines errant suffered losses disproportionate to their initial commitment, with nearly 200 battle brothers slain during void engagements against the secessionist fleet. Their expertise in ship-to-ship actions had placed them at the forefront of numerous boarding operations, a role that extracted a heavy toll in Astartes' lives despite their specialized training. The chapter's remaining strength was further stretched by their assignment to secure the Badab sector's shipping lanes against the emerging Red Corsairs' threat, preventing them from withdrawing to their fortress monastery for proper reorganization. Even the Minotaurs, who had entered the conflict later than other loyalist chapters, recorded 120 casualties, a significant number for a chapter that typically operated with methodical precision rather than engaging in attritional warfare. The Star Phantoms paid a similar price, with approximately 140 battle brothers lost during their systematic campaign against the Mantis warriors and subsequent operations on Badab Primaris. The Karkarodon's losses remained unknown, as the chapter withdrew into the void immediately after the fall of Palace Crimson, declining to provide casualty reports to the inquisitorial authorities overseeing the war's conclusion. Their fleet was last observed translating into the warp at the system's edge, their destination unrecorded in Imperial logs. This departure, conducted without formal notification or ceremony, reinforced their reputation as enigmatic hunters who answered to no authority save their own inscrutable purposes. Material losses extended far beyond Astartes' lives. Hundreds of warships, from mighty battle barges to escort frigates, had been destroyed or damaged beyond practical repair. Thousands of support craft, Thunderhawks, drop pods, and orbital lighters had been lost to enemy action or sacrificed in desperate extraction operations. Irreplaceable relics dating back millennia, from ancient Contemptor dreadnoughts to master-crafted weapons borne by chapter heroes, now lay shattered amid the rubble of contested worlds or drifted as debris in the cold void between stars. For the secessionist chapters, the war's outcome proved even more catastrophic. The Astral Claws ceased to exist as a loyalist entity, with approximately 200 survivors transforming into the heretical Red Corsairs under Huron Blackheart's leadership. Their gene seed was declared excommunicate traitoris, their records expunged from chapter rolls, and their very name prohibited from utterance, except in the sealed chambers of inquisitorial fortresses, where such knowledge remained necessary for ongoing containment operations. The Lamenters, Mantis warriors, and executioners, while spared outright destruction, faced judgment that would shape their fate for centuries to come. The inquisitorial tribunals established to determine their punishment convened aboard the battle barge Sword of Orden in the early days of 914, with representatives from the Ordo Hereticus, Ordo Malleus, and Ordo Astartes present to weigh evidence and pronounce sentence. The tribunal chambers reflected the solemnity of the proceedings. Ancient tapestries depicting the Emperor's Great Crusade hung alongside more recent works commemorating loyalist victories during the Badab conflict. The central dais, constructed from black marble quarried from Terra itself, supported 3 ornate thrones where the senior inquisitors sat in judgment. Before them stood the representatives of each secessionist chapter, broken warriors who had fought with honor for a cause that had ultimately betrayed them. For the Lamenters, whose involvement had stemmed from genuine belief in Huron's stated goals of Astartes' autonomy, the tribunal's judgment acknowledged both their misguided loyalty and their honorable conduct throughout the conflict. Chapter Master Malachim Foros, his once handsome features now ravaged by both physical and psychological scars, stood before the inquisitors with dignified resignation as they pronounced a sentence of 100 years penitent crusade, during which the chapter would receive no imperial support or reinforcement. This punishment, while severe, recognized that the Lamenters had never fully embraced Huron's increasingly radical positions. They had maintained their own moral code throughout the conflict, refusing to target civilian populations and generally adhering to traditional Astartes combat doctrines, rather than adopting the more extreme measures employed by the Astral Claws in later stages. Most significantly, they had withdrawn from active operations against loyalist forces once evidence of Huron's genetic experimentation emerged, effectively removing themselves from the conflict's final phase. The Mantis warriors faced a similar judgment, though with additional restrictions reflecting their deeper involvement in Huron's rebellion. Chapter Master Khoisan Neodora, still bearing the wounds sustained during the fall of Oothika, accepted the tribunal's sentence with stoic dignity. A 100-year penitent crusade coupled with prohibitions against recruiting new members for the first 12 years and restrictions on their operational autonomy that would place them under direct inquisitorial oversight for the duration of their sentence. The specific terms of the Mantis warriors' penance reflected the tribunal's assessment of their particular failings. Their expertise in guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics had been employed to devastating effect against loyalist forces, resulting in disproportionate casualties that might have been avoided in more conventional engagements. By restricting their recruitment and placing them under oversight, the tribunal sought to ensure that their specialized combat doctrine would be redirected against the Emperor's enemies rather than his servants. For the executioners, whose involvement had been predicated on their blood debt to Huron rather than ideological alignment, the tribunal's judgment acknowledged the complex honor code that had both drawn them into the conflict and ultimately led to their withdrawal. Chapter Master Arkash Hakin, his massive frame somehow diminished by the weight of recent events, received the tribunal's sentence without visible reaction. A 100-year penitent crusade with specific directives to target xenos threats along the galactic rim, areas where their particular combat doctrines would prove most effective against the Imperium's enemies. The executioner's sentence included a unique provision that recognized their cultural emphasis on personal honor and blood debt. The chapter would be permitted to maintain its traditional practices regarding honor duels and headhunting, customs that had been questioned by more orthodox imperial authorities in the past. This concession acknowledged that the executioner's culture, while divergent from codex norms, represented a valuable martial tradition that could serve the Imperium effectively when properly directed. All 3 chapters faced additional sanctions beyond their penitent crusades. Their fortress monasteries and associated holdings were forfeit, to be redistributed according to inquisitorial discretion. Their fleet assets were reduced to the minimum necessary for crusade operations, with excess vessels transferred to loyalist chapters that had suffered significant losses during the conflict. Most painfully, each chapter was required to provide gene seed tithe beyond standard requirements, both to verify their continued genetic purity and to compensate for their actions against the Imperium. The implementation of these sentences began immediately. The surviving lamenters, numbering barely 300 battle brothers, gathered their remaining equipment and departed for the eastern fringe, where xenos incursions provided ample opportunity for redemptive service. Their yellow armor, once bright and meticulously maintained, now bore the scars of defeat and penitence, a visual reminder of their chapter's continuing curse. The Mantis warriors, reduced to approximately 200 effective warriors, were assigned to operations along the Damocles Gulf, where Tau expansion threatened Imperial worlds. Their specialized infiltration tactics proved particularly effective against Tau auxiliary forces, allowing the chapter to record significant victories despite their reduced numbers. These successes, while insufficient to erase their shame, provided a foundation for eventual redemption. The executioners, with nearly 400 battle brothers surviving the conflict, directed their crusade toward Orc-held territories in the galactic southwest. Chapter Master Haken, determined to demonstrate his warriors' continued value to the Imperium, personally led assaults against several Orc warbosses, claiming their heads in ritual combat that satisfied both his chapter's traditions and their penitent obligations. These victories, achieved against overwhelming odds, gradually rebuilt the executioner's reputation among Imperial commanders familiar with their operations. The path to redemption proved arduous for all three chapters. Operating without proper supply lines or support infrastructure, they were forced to salvage equipment from battlefields and adapt standard tactics to accommodate their limited resources. Casualties could not be replaced at sustainable rates, creating a constant pressure to preserve their dwindling numbers while still fulfilling their crusade obligations. Most challenging was the psychological burden of their status-proud Astartes warriors reduced to penitent servants, their former glory replaced by a desperate struggle for eventual restoration. Yet amid these hardships, each chapter discovered unexpected strengths. The Lamenters, long accustomed to operating under adverse conditions due to their cursed founding, demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to their penitent status. Their experience with gene seed degradation had taught them techniques for maximizing combat effectiveness despite limited resources, allowing them to achieve victories that would have been impossible for less adaptable forces. The Mantis warriors found that inquisitorial oversight, initially viewed as a humiliating restriction, provided access to intelligence networks that enhanced their already formidable infiltration capabilities. Ordo Xenos operatives, recognizing the chapter's value against certain alien threats, gradually shifted from supervisors to collaborators, creating partnerships that would continue long after the formal penitent period concluded. For the executioners, the crusade offered opportunities to demonstrate their unique combat doctrines against worthy opponents, restoring their warrior pride through honorable victories rather than political rehabilitation. Their emphasis on individual combat prowess made them particularly effective against Orc leadership, allowing small forces to achieve disproportionate strategic impact by decapitating enemy command structures. As these chapters pursued their redemption, the Badab sector itself underwent comprehensive reorganization under inquisitorial authority. Worlds that had actively supported Huron's rebellion faced varying degrees of sanction, from population decimation to complete planetary interdiction. The sector's economic infrastructure, severely damaged by both conflict and Huron's exploitative policies, required massive Imperial investment to restore productive capacity. Most significant was the reorganization of the Maelstrom Zone's defense structure. The concept of the Maelstrom Warders was permanently abandoned, replaced by a more traditional Imperial defense framework, with clear chains of command leading directly to segmentum authorities. Space Marine chapters assigned to the region would operate independently rather than under unified command, preventing any future warlord from concentrating Astartes' power under personal authority. While Imperial authorities worked to rebuild the shattered sector, Huron Blackheart consolidated his position within the Maelstrom. The Red Corsairs grew steadily in strength, absorbing renegade elements from various chapters and establishing a network of bases throughout the Warp Storm's twisted reaches. Their raids against Imperial shipping increased in both frequency and sophistication, evolving from simple piracy to strategic operations targeting specific technologies and resources. By 920, the Red Corsairs had established themselves as one of the most significant non-chaos aligned renegade forces in the Segmentum. Their fleet, expanded through both capture and construction at hidden shipyards within the Maelstrom, regularly challenged Imperial Navy patrols along major shipping lanes. Their ground forces, now numbering nearly 500 Astartes supplemented by thousands of human auxiliaries, conducted planetary raids with increasing audacity, sometimes holding Imperial worlds for weeks before withdrawing with captured resources and technology. Most concerning to inquisitorial observers was Huron's apparent ability to offer sanctuary to other renegade elements. The Red Corsairs' territory within the Maelstrom became a haven for warriors who had broken from their chapters for reasons ranging from doctrinal disputes to outright heresy. Blackheart welcomed these additions regardless of their background, creating a force of unprecedented diversity, united only by their rejection of Imperial authority and loyalty to their new master. This gathering of renegades presented a unique threat to Imperial security. Unlike traditional Chaos warbands, whose ideological commitments often limited their strategic flexibility, the Red Corsairs operated with pragmatic efficiency, unmarred by excessive ritual or factional infighting. Huron maintained strict discipline among his followers, executing those who allowed personal vendettas or religious fervor to interfere with operational objectives. This approach created a renegade force with many of the organizational strengths of loyalist chapters, but unconstrained by their moral limitations or administrative oversight. By the late 41st millennium, the consequences of the Badab War continued to reverberate throughout the Imperium. The penitent chapters gradually rebuilt their strength, their crusades taking them to battlefields far from their original territories. The Red Corsairs expanded their operations beyond the Maelstrom's edges, establishing a reputation as one of the most dangerous renegade forces in the galaxy. Imperial authorities maintained heightened vigilance around the Maelstrom Zone, aware that the threat posed by Huron Blackheart might eventually eclipse even the destruction wrought during his original rebellion. The war's most enduring legacy, however, was its demonstration of the fragile balance between Astartes' autonomy and Imperial oversight. The Badab conflict revealed both the dangers of excessive chapter independence and the limitations of centralized control over forces designed for operational freedom. This tension, never fully resolved, would continue to shape interactions between the Adeptus Astartes and other Imperial institutions throughout subsequent centuries, a constant reminder of how quickly noble intentions could transform into devastating rebellion when pride and ambition eclipsed duty and faith. As the 42nd millennium approached, and the galaxy faced unprecedented threats from awakening Necrons, expanding Tau, and the ever-present shadow of chaos, the lessons of Badab remained relevant to Imperial commanders and strategists. The conflict stood as a stark warning about the consequences of divided loyalty and the terrible price paid when the Emperor's finest warriors turned their unmatched capabilities against the Imperium they were created to defend.